Welcome to In the Shadows. I'm Jack, your guide for tonight's show of scary stories to fall asleep. You'll find no ads here, just a black screen, the sound of rain, and unsettling tales to help you relax. As you listen, comment where you're watching from and what time it is. It's something that fascinates me, and I'm grateful for each of you tuning in. If you enjoy the show, remember to like and subscribe. We have no breaks here, just endless stories to ease you into the night. Let's begin. We got to the cabin late in the afternoon, just as the sun was starting to dip below the trees. The sky had that soft, fading light that makes everything look a little more golden than it should, almost as if the bayou itself was glowing. The air was thick, damp, and sticky, the kind of humidity that makes you feel like you're walking through a wet blanket. The cabin itself wasn't much to look at, just an old wooden shack with peeling paint and a sagging roof, barely standing on stilts above the murky water. But we didn't care. We weren't here for luxury. We were here for the fishing, the solitude, and the fact that no one would bother us for miles. It was me, Alex, Mike, and Jess. Just 4 friends looking for a weekend of peace and quiet away from everything. Mike was the one who found the place, and honestly, I think we were all a little surprised by how isolated it really was. No phone signal, no neighbors, no nothing. Just the swamp, stretching out in every direction, as far as the eye could see. I remember thinking it felt like we were the last people left on Earth. There was a stillness in the air, the kind that only happens right before the evening rain starts to fall. Sure enough, as we unloaded the car, the first drops began to patter against the roof. Alex muttered something about how perfect the timing was, and we all laughed. By the time we got everything inside, it was coming down pretty hard. The rain hit the water surrounding the cabin, creating ripples that spread out endlessly into the darkening swamp. The cabin was basic, just a couple of rooms, a tiny kitchen, and a porch that faced the water. But it had what we needed, a place to sleep, a place to cook, and a dock for the boat we'd rented. After we got settled in, we cracked open some beers and sat out on the porch watching the rain fall. The sound of it was kind of relaxing at first, like a gentle drumming against the roof. None of us said much. We just sat there listening to the bayou. Then, out of nowhere, Mike decided he wanted to explore. He wasn't one for sitting still for too long, and with the rain, he figured it'd be a good time to check out the area around the cabin. So we grabbed our flashlights and followed him down the narrow path that led into the reeds. The rain made the ground soft under our feet, and I remember the way the reeds seemed to sway in the wind, brushing against us as we walked. After a few minutes, we came across something we weren't expecting. Tucked away in the middle of the reeds, hidden from sight, was a small makeshift shrine. It wasn't much, just a pile of stones with a few odd trinkets placed on top. A doll made of sticks, some feathers tied with string, and a small, rusted metal charm that looked like it had been there for years. Jess laughed, saying it looked like something out of a bad horror movie, but there was something about it that made me uneasy. Mike, being Mike, reached out and knocked the doll over with the end of his flashlight, muttering something about superstitions. We didn't think much of it at the time, just a weird little thing left behind by someone who probably used to live out here. But as we walked back to the cabin, the rain falling harder now, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had disturbed something we shouldn't have. That night, the rain didn't let up. It came down in thick sheets, pounding against the roof and filling the air with a steady, heavy rhythm. We stayed inside, playing cards and joking around, but I couldn't get that shrine out of my head. Something about the way it looked, so out of place in the middle of nowhere, kept creeping back into my thoughts. But I didn't say anything. Mike was acting like his usual self, loud, cracking jokes and chugging beer as if nothing had happened. Jess and Alex were right there with him, laughing at something stupid Mike had said, and for a while, I forgot about the whole thing. Then, sometime after midnight, the power went out. It wasn't surprising, really. Being this far out in the middle of the bayou, I'd half expected something like that to happen. But the way it happened, all at once, no flickering or warning, just total blackness, caught us off guard. We all sat there in the dark, waiting for it to come back, but it didn't. Alex grabbed his flashlight and clicked it on, the beam cutting through the cabin's tiny living room. Mike joked about it being the start of some horror movie, and Jess laughed. But the mood had shifted. Something about the pitch-black night pressing in on the cabin felt different now. After a few minutes, I told Mike we should check the fuse box outside. We grabbed our flashlights and went out into the rain, which hadn't slowed down at all. The ground was soaked, mud sticking to our boots as we trudged around the back of the cabin. The fuse box was old, rusted, and not something we really knew how to deal with. Mike was fiddling with it when I noticed something off in the distance, just beyond the reach of my flashlight. It was barely there, just a faint movement in the reeds, but it was enough to catch my attention. I swept the beam of light across the water, but there was nothing there, just rain and shadows. Still, the feeling stuck with me that something or someone was out there watching us. I didn't mention it to Mike. He was still busy cursing the fuse box and the rain. We gave up after a few more minutes and went back inside. The others were waiting, sitting around the table with the flickering glow of a few candles they'd lit. Jess asked if we'd seen anything weird out there, but I brushed it off, not wanting to sound paranoid. That's when the scratching started. At first, it was so faint that I thought it was just the wind pushing some branches against the side of the cabin. But it kept going, slow and deliberate, like someone dragging something sharp across the wooden walls. Alex stood up, his face lit by the candlelight, and walked toward the front door, flashlight in hand. He opened it, shining the beam outside, but there was nothing there, just the rain and the bayou stretching out into the darkness. He closed the door, shaking his head, but the scratching continued. Jess made some joke about the place being haunted, but no one laughed this time. It was getting under all our skin, the way that sound just wouldn't stop. It felt like the rain itself had turned hostile, pounding against the windows as the scratching grew louder. And then Mike spoke. Only it wasn't Mike's voice. It was deeper, raspy, like something was crawling up from the back of his throat. We all turned to look at him, and for a split second he looked different, as if his face had changed, the shadows playing tricks on us in the flickering candlelight. He was staring at the wall, his lips moving, but none of the words made sense. Jess called his name, laughing nervously, but he didn't respond. He just kept muttering in that strange voice. That was when I felt it, deep down, that we had disturbed something we shouldn't have. Something was wrong. Mike didn't snap out of it for what felt like hours, but it was probably just a few minutes. We were all frozen in place, watching him as he sat there, muttering words that didn't belong to him, his eyes fixed on the wall as if he were looking at something we couldn't see. The rain outside was relentless, hammering the windows harder now, and the sound of it seemed to sync with his strange whispering, creating this eerie, hypnotic rhythm. I remember Jess reaching out, touching Mike's arm gently, her voice shaky but trying to stay calm, asking him what was going on. But Mike didn't answer. Instead, he turned slowly, almost mechanically, and looked at her, his face twisted into an expression I had never seen before, cold, detached, like he didn't even recognize her. Then he spoke again, only this time it was louder, more forceful, and it definitely wasn't his voice. It sounded like someone or something else was speaking through him, words tumbling out in a language none of us understood. It was harsh, guttural, and I swear it seemed to make the whole cabin feel smaller, like the walls were closing in. That's when things got worse. Mike stood up suddenly, knocking over his chair with a loud thud, and he started pacing back and forth, his hands gripping his head as if he were trying to fight something off. Alex grabbed him, trying to shake him out of it, but Mike shoved him back with a strength I didn't know he had, sending Alex crashing into the table. The candles flickered wildly, casting long, distorted shadows across the walls, and for a moment I thought I saw movement outside the window, something shifting in the rain. Jess screamed, yelling for Mike to stop, but he was too far gone. He started shouting, the words coming out faster, more jumbled, and then he began scratching at his arms, tearing at his skin like he was trying to claw something out. I rushed forward, grabbing his hands to stop him, but he stared at me with those same unfamiliar eyes, and for a second, I swore they weren't his. They were dark, hollow, like something was staring back at me from deep inside him. Then, all at once, the scratching outside stopped. Everything went deathly quiet except for the sound of the rain. Mike stopped struggling, his body going limp, and he slumped to the floor, gasping for air. We stood there, stunned, trying to process what had just happened. I looked around, expecting something, anything, to explain what we just witnessed, but the cabin was silent again. Silent, except for Mike's ragged breathing. Jess knelt beside him, shaking, asking if he was okay, but Mike didn't answer. He just lay there, staring up at the ceiling, his chest rising and falling as if he were fighting off some unseen force. Then, without warning, he started laughing. Not his usual laugh, but this low, unsettling sound that seemed to come from somewhere deep within him. Alex and I backed away, exchanging nervous glances, and that's when Mike spoke again. "I told you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She's coming for us." I didn't know what he meant, but the way he said it sent a chill through the room. Jess was crying now, shaking him, begging him to stop, but he just kept laughing, his eyes still locked on the ceiling. And then the drumming started again. Louder this time, closer. It was coming from all around us, surrounding the cabin, echoing through the swamp like some ancient, primal call. Alex rushed to the window, peering out into the darkness, but there was nothing there. Just the rain and the endless expanse of reeds swaying in the storm. But the drumming didn't stop. It kept getting louder, faster, until it felt like it was vibrating through the very floorboards beneath us. That's when I saw it. In the corner of my eye, just outside the cabin, standing in the reeds. A figure. At first I thought it was just the shadows playing tricks on me. But the longer I stared, the more certain I became. Someone or something was out there watching us. It didn't move, didn't flinch, just stood there, barely visible through the rain. I opened my mouth to say something, but the words wouldn't come. And then, as if on cue, Mike's body went rigid. He bolted upright, his eyes wide, his voice now a frantic whisper. "She's here." That's when the cabin door slammed open, and everything descended into chaos. The door crashed against the wall with a force that shook the entire cabin. Rain poured in, wind whipping the candles out, plunging us into complete darkness. I grabbed the flashlight and fumbled to turn it on, the beam barely cutting through the thick, swirling air. In that moment, it felt like the outside world had forced its way in, like the bayou itself was alive and angry, clawing at us. Mike was still sitting there, motionless now, but his eyes were wide open, staring straight ahead like he was in some kind of trance. Jess was shouting at him, shaking him by the shoulders, but he didn't react. And then, that voice, his voice, but not his at the same time, came out again, quiet at first, but growing louder with each word. "She's here. She's always been here." I remember Alex grabbing me, his face pale in the faint light of the flashlight, telling me we needed to get out of there. But I couldn't move. It was like the weight of everything, the rain, the drumming, the open door was holding me in place. And then I saw it again. The figure in the reeds, standing motionless, just beyond the door. This time, there was no mistaking it. It was a woman, or at least something shaped like one, but her features were all wrong. Her face was covered in strange symbols, her eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. She was wrapped in tattered robes, her head tilted slightly, like she was listening for something. The drumming grew louder, as if it were coming from her, vibrating through the air, shaking the very foundation of the cabin. Mike's voice rose to match it, repeating the same words over and over in that foreign, guttural language. Jess was crying now, her hands gripping his arms, begging him to snap out of it. But it was like he was gone, lost in whatever had taken hold of him. That's when Alex grabbed Jess, pulling her away from Mike, and started dragging her toward the door. "We have to go," he kept saying, his voice frantic. "We have to leave now." I stumbled after them, but something made me turn back. Mike was still sitting there, rocking slightly, muttering to himself. And for a second, just a second, his eyes locked on mine. He smiled, but it wasn't a smile I recognized. It was cold, empty, like something else was looking at me through his body. That's when it hit me. This wasn't Mike anymore. Whatever we had disturbed, whatever that shrine was meant to contain, it had taken him. My mind raced, trying to piece it all together. The shrine, the symbols, the strange voice that had come out of him. This wasn't just some weird backwoods superstition. This was real. I don't know why, but I thought back to that moment when we found the shrine, the way Mike had knocked the doll over without a second thought. It felt like a mistake now, a line we shouldn't have crossed. This was punishment, retribution for something we didn't even understand. And now it was too late. I turned and ran after Alex and Jess, my feet slipping in the mud as we bolted toward the boat. The drumming grew louder with every step, almost deafening now, and I swear I could hear something else mixed in with it. A low, guttural growl, like the bayou itself was alive, angry. We reached the boat, rain pelting us from all sides, but the engine wouldn't start. Alex was yanking on the pull cord, cursing under his breath, while Jess sat in the back, staring at the cabin, her eyes wide with fear. I looked back, and for a moment, I thought I saw Mike standing in the doorway. But it wasn't him. It was the woman. She stood there, motionless, watching us, her glowing eyes piercing through the rain. I don't know what it was about that moment, but something inside me snapped, and I jumped into the water, pushing the boat away from the shore with all the strength I had. We were moving now, drifting away from the cabin, away from Mike, but the drumming didn't stop. It followed us, echoing through the bayou until we were too far to hear anything but the rain. As the cabin disappeared into the darkness, I felt this overwhelming sense that we had barely escaped something we were never supposed to see. And Mike was gone. We didn't talk on the way back. Just sat in silence as the boat cut through the bayou, the rain still pouring down. The drumming had faded, but the memory of it echoed in my mind, looping over and over, like it was part of me now. Jess sat curled up in the corner of the boat, staring at nothing, her eyes hollow. Alex kept his head down, gripping the steering handle so tightly his knuckles were white. We were miles away from that cabin, but it didn't feel like we'd escaped. Even when we made it back to the dock, climbed into the car, and drove for hours, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still with us. Days later, back home, I kept replaying it all in my head. Mike's voice, the woman in the reeds, the cursed shrine we should have never touched. I couldn't explain what happened, and I didn't try. But every so often late at night, I'd hear that same faint drumming in the distance, like it was calling me back, and I'd wonder if Mike was still out there, trapped in that cabin, waiting for us to return. I still don't know what we unleashed that night, but I know one thing for sure. We should have left it alone. We started the hike on a cool fall afternoon, setting out along a well-worn trail deep in the Black Hills of South Dakota. It wasn't our first hiking trip together, and the vibe was easygoing, full of casual banter and shared excitement for the adventure ahead. There were 5 of us: me, Dave, Ellie, Sean, and Kara, our unofficial leader, who always seemed to know her way around the wilderness. I remember Kara smiling as she adjusted the straps on her backpack, glancing up at the sky that had already begun to fade from blue to a hazy gray. A storm was coming, but none of us were concerned. In fact, it added a sense of thrill to our journey. Rain tapping on the trees, mist rolling in. It all felt like the kind of eerie atmosphere you'd expect in a movie, but we joked about it. A few miles into the hike, the trail got rougher. We took a break by a small stream, the sound of running water mixing with the wind that had picked up slightly. I was the first to notice something off the path. A cluster of stones arranged in a perfect circle, like it was deliberate. They looked ancient, weathered by time, and scattered around the stones were what appeared to be small bones, cracked and brittle. Dave laughed, tossing a stick toward the stones, saying something about weirdos leaving their art projects in the woods. But Kara stared at the stones for a long time, not laughing, her face unusually serious. Probably just some old hunting ritual or something. Sean shrugged, already pulling out his camera to snap a picture. We stood there for a while, not saying much, until Ellie nudged us to keep moving. It was getting late. The clouds had rolled in fast, covering the sky in a thick blanket of gray, and the wind felt colder than it should have been for early autumn. As we started walking again, I couldn't help but glance back at the circle of stones. Something about it stayed with me, like a faint whisper I couldn't quite catch. The trail became harder to follow after that. The signs seemed to disappear, and soon we were cutting through dense trees. Kara kept the map in her hands, her eyes scanning it as she led the way, but there was a tension in the air none of us could shake. We hadn't seen another hiker for hours. The path ahead twisted, leading us deeper into the forest as the daylight continued to fade. The wind picked up, sending leaves spiraling around us as the first drops of rain began to fall. Just a light drizzle at first, tapping softly against the leaves in our jackets. None of us said anything, but we all moved a little faster. As the evening pressed in, the trees thickened around us, their shadows stretching like fingers, making it harder to tell where the trail even was anymore. Kara slowed down, glancing at the map again, her brow furrowed as she tried to make sense of it. "I think we're close to the clearing," she muttered, but her voice sounded uncertain, like she wasn't really talking to us anymore. We just nodded, trusting her, as the drizzle turned into a steady rain. The drops slid down my face, blurring my vision as we moved forward into the fading light. By the time we reached the clearing, it was almost dark. We all stopped when we saw it, scattered through the grass just ahead of us, another circle of stones. And more bones. A lot more. We stood there in the clearing, staring at that circle of stones for what felt like forever. No one said a word at first, the rain now falling steadily, soaking through our jackets and dripping from the ends of our hair. The stones looked just like the ones we'd seen earlier, but larger, more deliberate, and the bones scattered among them were unmistakable. They weren't just small animal bones like before. These were bigger, older, and there were more of them. Sean was the first to break the silence, trying to lighten the mood. "Guess we found the town dump for all the deer hunters, huh?" he said with a forced laugh. But no one else laughed this time. Not even Dave, who always found a way to make things into a joke. Ellie took a step back, her eyes wide as she glanced over at Kara. "What is this?" she whispered, but Kara just shook her head. She didn't have an answer. None of us did. The rain was picking up now, harder, and the wind seemed to be pushing us, urging us forward, but something about that clearing made us hesitate. I couldn't shake the feeling that we shouldn't be there, that whatever we'd stumbled upon wasn't meant for us to see. "We should keep moving," Kara finally said, her voice low. "We're losing light, and we need to find a place to set up camp." We all agreed, though no one moved right away. It was like our feet were stuck to the ground, drawn to the circle, to those stones, to the bones lying between them. Finally, Kara started walking, and the rest of us followed, staying close together as we pushed past the clearing and into the thickening trees beyond. The rain was coming down hard now, making it harder to see, harder to hear anything but the steady rhythm of it hitting the leaves and the forest floor. The trail was long gone, lost in the storm and the darkness, and Kara had given up on the map, stuffing it into her pack with a frustrated sigh. "We'll camp here," she said suddenly, stopping in a small grove where the trees formed a kind of natural shelter from the rain. It wasn't ideal, but none of us argued. We just wanted to get out of the rain and rest for the night. The tents went up quickly, though the rain made everything more difficult. By the time we were done, we were all soaked, shivering as we huddled around a small fire that Sean had managed to get going despite the wet ground. No one talked much as we sat there, the rain still falling steadily beyond our small circle of light. It felt like the storm had closed in around us, trapping us in that grove, keeping us from going any further. Every once in a while, I thought I heard something beyond the trees, a soft murmur, almost like voices carried on the wind. But whenever I tried to listen closer, it was gone, lost in the rain. Kara sat a little apart from us, staring into the fire, her face illuminated by its flickering light. I couldn't tell what she was thinking, but there was a look on her face I hadn't seen before, like she knew something. Like she understood more about what we'd seen in that clearing than she was letting on. Sean was the first to turn in, disappearing into his tent with a mumbled goodnight. Ellie followed soon after, pulling her hood tight over her head as she crawled into her tent, leaving just me, Dave, and Kara by the fire. We didn't say much, just stared at the flames, listening to the rain, each of us lost in our own thoughts. It wasn't until the fire started to die down that Kara finally spoke. "We shouldn't have come here," she said quietly, barely loud enough to hear over the rain. Dave and I looked at each other, unsure what she meant. Before we could ask, she stood up and walked away from the fire, disappearing into the shadows of the trees without another word. We waited for her to come back. But she didn't. We waited, expecting Kara to reappear any moment, but the minutes stretched on. The fire had burned low and the rain had become a constant drumbeat around us, loud enough that it drowned out any other sound. Dave stood up, squinting into the darkness where Kara had disappeared. "She's probably just, clearing her head or something," he said, but his voice wasn't convincing. I nodded, trying to agree, but something was gnawing at me, something more than just worry. The shadows beyond the trees seemed deeper, like they were swallowing the little light we had left from the dying fire. "We should go after her," I finally said, standing up and grabbing my flashlight. Dave hesitated, glancing at the two tents where Ellie and Sean were already asleep, but he nodded. We stepped into the darkness, the beam from my flashlight cutting a thin path through the rain-soaked trees. We called her name, Kara, over and over, but there was no answer. The forest seemed to press in around us, the rain falling heavier, each drop louder than the last, until it was all we could hear. I kept scanning the woods, the flashlight flickering as it hit the trunks of trees, the twisted branches, the thick undergrowth, but there was no sign of her. We went further, calling her name louder, but every step felt like we were walking deeper into something we weren't supposed to. And then we heard it. A voice. Not Kara's, but something else, something low and guttural, whispering through the trees. At first I thought it was just the rain, but as we stood still listening, the voice became clearer. It wasn't speaking in words I could understand, but the sound of it crawled under my skin, making my breath quicken. Dave turned toward me, his face pale in the faint light from the flashlight. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, but I couldn't bring myself to speak. The voice came again, louder this time, closer, like it was circling us, moving through the trees just beyond where we could see. I swung the flashlight toward the sound, but all I saw were the thick trunks of the trees and the rain dripping down their bark. "Kara!" Dave shouted. But the sound of his voice was swallowed by the rain. That's when we saw the shadow. It moved between the trees, too fast to be anything human. A figure tall and dark, its shape barely visible against the blackness of the woods. It didn't move like a person. It glided, disappearing and reappearing between the trunks, like it was watching us, waiting. Neither of us moved, both frozen as the shadow circled us again, the whispers growing louder, clearer. And then, out of nowhere, the voice stopped. Silence fell, thick and heavy, broken only by the relentless sound of the rain. "Kara!" Dave's voice cracked as he called out again, but this time it wasn't a shout, it was a plea. We both stood there, not knowing what to do next. I swept the flashlight one more time, my hand shaking as the beam hit the circle of stones. It was back, right in front of us, like we had never left it, the stones larger now, the bones scattered more chaotically. And standing in the center was Kara, or at least something that looked like her. Her back was to us, her arms hanging loosely at her sides, her head tilted forward, the rain streaming off her body as she stood perfectly still. "Kara!" Dave yelled, rushing toward her, but I grabbed his arm, pulling him back. Something was wrong. This wasn't Kara. I could feel it deep down, the way she stood there, motionless, like she was waiting for something. I shined the flashlight on her, and in that moment, she turned slowly, her face hidden in shadow. But her eyes, they weren't her eyes. They were black, empty, like the woods had swallowed her whole and left behind something else. Dave stumbled back, muttering something under his breath, but I couldn't take my eyes off her. She raised her hands slowly, pointing at the stones, and whispered one word, so quiet I barely heard it over the rain. "Sacrifice." The word hung in the air, barely louder than the rain, but it echoed in my mind, sinking deeper with each passing second. Sacrifice. It didn't sound like Kara's voice, but something twisted, distorted, like it was coming from somewhere far beyond her. I backed away, pulling Dave with me, but he was staring at her, frozen, his eyes wide with disbelief. "This can't be real," he muttered, shaking his head, but I could see in his face that he knew. This was no longer the Kara we knew. I kept thinking about the stones, the bones, the strange patterns we'd seen earlier, trying to piece it all together. And then it hit me. The stories I'd brushed off as local folklore before the trip. Stories about ancient rituals deep in the Black Hills, sacrifices made to something dark, something that fed on the lost and the desperate. We weren't supposed to be here. We'd stumbled into something we didn't understand, something ancient that was now demanding a price. "Kara, we need to go," I said, my voice shaky, trying to sound calm even though every instinct told me to run. But she didn't move. She stood there, in the center of the circle, her hands still outstretched, her black eyes fixed on the stones. The whispers started again, louder this time, and I realized they weren't just coming from her. They were all around us, in the trees, in the rain, in the very air we were breathing. And then, in a sudden flash, it all made sense. The bones, the stones, the whispers, it was all part of some kind of ritual, something that had been started long before we'd ever arrived. We had wandered into it by accident, but now we were part of it, trapped in a game we didn't understand, with rules we couldn't break. The stones, they weren't just markers, they were boundaries, a circle of protection, or maybe even a trap, keeping whatever was inside from escaping. And Kara, she wasn't herself anymore. She was part of it now, claimed by whatever force was lurking in the woods, waiting for its sacrifice. "We have to get out of here," I whispered to Dave, but he didn't respond. He was still staring at Kara, like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. I grabbed his arm and pulled him back, away from the circle, away from the stones. But the whispers grew louder, angry now, like they knew we were trying to leave. "Kara!" Dave yelled again, but this time, there was no response. She didn't even look at us. She just stood there, her eyes empty, her body still as the rain poured down on us. We turned and ran, my flashlight bouncing wildly in the darkness as we crashed through the trees, the whispers following us, growing louder with every step. I didn't dare look back. I didn't need to. I knew she was still standing there, watching us, waiting for us to come back. We tore through the forest, the rain now coming down in sheets, soaking us to the bone as we stumbled over roots and branches, trying to find our way back to camp. But no matter how far we ran, the whispers followed. And somewhere, deep in the woods, I could still hear Kara's voice, or whatever was left of her, whispering that same word over and over: sacrifice. We didn't stop running until we crashed through the trees and stumbled back into the clearing where our tents were pitched. The rain was relentless now, drumming against the fabric of the tents, pooling in the mud at our feet. But it was the silence that hit me the hardest. No whispers, no shadows, nothing but the rain falling around us. We were soaked out of breath and completely disoriented, but we were back, except for Kara. Ellie and Sean were already awake, standing by the dying fire, their faces twisted in confusion and fear as they stared at us. "What the hell happened?" Sean demanded, stepping forward, his eyes darting between me and Dave. But I couldn't answer. I didn't know how to explain what we had just seen, what had just happened in those woods. "She's gone," Dave muttered, wiping the rain from his face. "Kara's gone." The words felt heavy, like they didn't belong in this world, like saying them out loud made them more real. Ellie looked at us, her eyes wide, panic setting in as she realized what Dave meant. "She just disappeared," I whispered, shaking my head as I tried to make sense of it all. "We found her in the clearing, but it wasn't her." "Not really." Sean and Ellie didn't say anything. They just stared at us, waiting for an explanation we couldn't give. We packed up in silence, none of us speaking, as we tore down the tents and stuffed everything back into our bags. The rain hadn't let up, but it didn't matter. We had to leave. We couldn't stay in those woods, not after what we'd seen. Not with Kara still out there, or whatever was left of her. It took hours to find our way back to the main trail. The path slippery and almost impossible to follow in the rain, but we didn't stop. Not until we were back at the trailhead, standing in the parking lot with the storm still raging above us. We didn't talk on the way home. No one wanted to. It wasn't until days later, after the storm had passed and the search parties had scoured the hills, that the full weight of what had happened started to sink in. Kara was gone. The authorities searched for weeks, combing every inch of the Black Hills, but they never found her. No footprints, no clothes, not even a trace of where she might have gone. They questioned us, of course. We told them everything we could remember, though we left out the parts that sounded too unbelievable, too insane to be real. We didn't mention the stones, or the bones, or the whispers. No one would have believed us anyway. I tried to move on after that, to put the whole thing behind me, but it's never really left me. Sometimes, in the dead of night, when the rain is falling hard against my window, I can still hear those whispers. Quiet at first, almost like a memory, but they grow louder, just like they did in the woods. And sometimes when I close my eyes, I see her. Standing in the circle of stones, her eyes black as coal, her hand outstretched and that word on her lips, sacrifice. I don't go hiking anymore, and part of me wonders if Kara is still out there, wandering those woods, waiting for someone else to stumble into that clearing, into that ritual. Or maybe she never left. Maybe whatever claimed her is still waiting, still watching. I can't shake the feeling that it's not over, that somehow, someway, those whispers will come back for me too. It was supposed to be just another weekend in the mountains, a chance for us to disconnect from the world for a few days and enjoy some much-needed solitude. Mark, Dan, and I had planned the trip weeks in advance. 3 days of hiking through Wyoming's Wind River Range, miles from civilization. We'd been to the Rockies before, but the Wind River Range was different, wilder, quieter, and less forgiving. When we left town, the weather report warned of rain that might come in overnight, but we didn't think much of it. By the time we set up camp on the first night, the sky had begun to darken, the thick clouds rolling in slowly. We were miles away from anyone else, or so it felt, and the only sound was the low murmur of the wind through the trees, as if it was trying to say something we couldn't quite catch. The ground was uneven beneath our tents, but it didn't matter. We'd been looking forward to this trip for weeks, and no lumpy ground was going to ruin it. Mark had been the one to suggest the Wind River Range. He'd heard about it from some guy at work who liked to hike, said it was untouched compared to more popular spots, the kind of place where you could really get away. I didn't think much of it at the time, but there was something about the way he kept talking about it during the drive. Almost like he built it up in his head as more than just a destination. As we unpacked, I couldn't help but notice how quiet Mark had gotten. Usually he was the loudest, always cracking jokes and keeping things light. But that evening, he barely said a word, his eyes constantly darting around as if expecting to see something out there in the trees. Dan, on the other hand, was his usual laid-back self, digging through his pack and complaining about how he'd brought too many snacks. We laughed, and for a moment everything felt normal again. That was until Mark spoke up. He asked if we had heard something on the way up. Something like a voice, but not quite. Dan laughed it off, saying it was probably just the wind messing with him. I wanted to agree with Dan, but something about Mark's expression stuck with me. His voice wasn't joking like it usually was. It had that edge, the kind people get when they don't want to admit they're rattled. The rain started falling just as we finished eating dinner. Light at first, but steady enough that we decided to retreat to our tents early. The sound of it tapping against the nylon was soothing in a way, drowning out the occasional snap of twigs from somewhere deep in the forest. I thought it would help me sleep, but it didn't. As I lay there, staring up at the dark silhouette of the tent ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that something about this place was off. Not the kind of off you talk about when things are inconvenient or annoying, but deeper. A feeling that settled into your bones and refused to leave, no matter how hard you tried to ignore it. Eventually, I must have drifted off, but when I woke up sometime in the night, the rain was falling harder. A constant, unrelenting patter that made the inside of my tent feel even smaller. That's when I heard it. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, a trick of the wind, or maybe the sound of branches shifting in the rain. But there was something about it that kept me awake. something about the way it seemed to move through the trees. I couldn't tell if it was close or far away. I wanted to call out to Mark and Dan just to see if they were still awake, but the words got stuck somewhere between thought and action. Instead, I lay there, listening, the rain keeping me pinned to my sleeping bag. Eventually, the sound faded, and I told myself it was nothing, that I was being ridiculous. But in the back of my mind, that feeling stayed. Mark wasn't himself the next morning. He looked like he hadn't slept at all, his eyes sunken and his usual easy smile gone. When I asked him if he was okay, he just shrugged, said he was fine. But I could tell something was off, though I didn't press him on it. After all, we had a long day of hiking ahead of us, and I didn't want to start it off by nagging him. The rain had stopped, leaving the ground wet and slick as we packed up our gear. The plan was to push deeper into the range, find a spot near one of the lakes for the second night. As we set off, the trail was quiet again, the only sounds coming from our boots sloshing through the mud. The air felt thicker somehow, heavier than it had the day before. I didn't know it yet, but that would be the last time I felt anything close to normal on that trip. By the time we reached the burned-out cabin, the rain had started up again, a steady drizzle that made the whole area feel even more desolate than it already did. We'd been walking for hours, and the terrain had become rougher, the trees more twisted and sparse. It felt like we had wandered into a different world, far away from the familiar beauty of the mountains. Mark had barely spoken since we left camp, trudging ahead with a strange determination that didn't match his usual laid-back attitude. Dan and I exchanged a few glances, but neither of us said anything. We figured he was just tired or maybe annoyed with the weather. But as we reached the clearing where the cabin stood, I could tell something was wrong. The cabin was in worse shape than I'd expected. It wasn't just old, it looked like it had been through hell. Half the roof had caved in, and the blackened beams suggested it had caught fire at some point, though how or why was anyone's guess. The windows were broken, their jagged edges like sharp teeth, and the door hung crookedly off its hinges. The place looked like it hadn't seen a soul in decades. Dan was the first to suggest we check it out. "Might be a good place to take a break," he said, nodding toward the structure as he wiped rain off his face. Mark, who had been strangely quiet, didn't even hesitate. He just headed straight for the door without a word, as if he knew exactly where he was going. I followed, a little more cautiously. The whole scene felt wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on why. Maybe it was the smell, a faint, acrid scent that lingered in the air, like burnt wood mixed with something else, something I couldn't quite place. Or maybe it was the way Mark moved, too sure of himself, too eager to get inside. Dan was already stepping through the threshold when I caught up. Inside, the place was worse than it looked from the outside. The floorboards were warped and rotting, the walls covered in soot and what looked like ancient scratches, claw marks almost. There were remnants of old furniture, nothing more than piles of debris now. But what really got my attention was the fireplace. Nestled in the charred remains of the hearth was a small, leather-bound book, its cover worn but intact. Dan picked it up first, flipping it open with a curious grin. "Looks like we've got ourselves a little history lesson," he said, though there was something in his voice that made it clear he wasn't quite as confident as he was pretending to be. Mark, on the other hand, stepped forward like he had been waiting for this moment, his eyes locked on the book as if it held the answers to something only he knew about. I leaned in to get a better look as Dan started reading aloud. The handwriting was old, messy, but legible enough. It was a journal, written by someone who had lived in the cabin a long time ago, maybe back in the 1800s. The entries were strange, unsettling. They started off normal enough, talks of building the cabin, clearing the land, dealing with the harsh winters. But then things took a turn. The writer began to describe how the valley had been hit by some kind of illness. People were getting sick, losing their minds. But the journal writer didn't think it was just a disease. No, he was convinced something darker was at play. He wrote about hearing voices, seeing shadows that didn't belong, and feeling a presence in the valley that watched him at night. He talked about how the illness wasn't natural. It was a curse, a punishment. and as the entries went on, the tone got more frantic, more desperate. The last few pages were almost unreadable, filled with ramblings about demons and possession. I glanced over at Mark, who was standing there, staring at the journal like he was in a trance. His hands were clenched into fists, his knuckles white. Dan, still trying to play it cool, laughed nervously and shut the book. "Well, that's enough ghost stories for one day," he said, tossing it back into the fireplace. But Mark didn't move. He just kept staring at the ashes, his jaw tight. As we stepped back outside, the rain had picked up again and the light was fading fast. The atmosphere had shifted. The air felt colder, the trees closer, almost like they were leaning in, toward us. Mark didn't say a word as we gathered our things to move on, but there was something in the way he was walking, like he wasn't quite with us anymore. Like his mind was somewhere else. I tried to shake it off. Maybe he was just tired, or maybe the journal had gotten into his head a little too much. But as we headed deeper into the forest, that feeling stayed with me. The sense that something was following us, just out of sight. And the longer we walked, the quieter Mark became, his eyes never straying far from the ground, as if he was listening to something we couldn't hear. The rain was coming down harder now, the steady patter against the leaves turning into a constant roar. By the time we found a spot to set up camp, the sun had dipped below the horizon, and the forest around us had grown dark. We pitched our tents in silence, the only light coming from the faint glow of our headlamps as we worked. Mark still hadn't said a word. Later that night, as I lay in my tent listening to the rain, I couldn't help but think back to the journal, to the writer's words about voices in the valley. Part of me wanted to laugh it off, tell myself it was just an old man's delusion, nothing more. But another part of me couldn't help but wonder. The next morning, things took a turn. The rain hadn't let up overnight, and everything was soaked. The tents, the gear, and us. But that wasn't what had me on edge. It was Mark. He was standing outside his tent, staring off into the woods like he had somewhere to be. His eyes were vacant, distant, as if he didn't even notice the rain pouring down on him. Dan and I called out to him, asking if he was ready to pack up and move, but he didn't answer. It was as if he couldn't hear us at all. I walked over, nudging him on the shoulder, and finally, he turned to look at me. His expression was blank, and for a moment, I wasn't sure he even recognized me. "We should get going, man," I said, trying to keep it casual, trying not to let the weirdness get to me. Mark blinked a few times, like he was waking up from a deep sleep. Yeah, let's go," he muttered, but his voice was off. It didn't sound like him. It was flat, emotionless, like he was just going through the motions. Something was seriously wrong, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. As we packed up camp, I caught Dan giving me a look, his eyes wide with concern. He didn't say anything, but I knew we were both thinking the same thing. What the hell was going on with Mark? He'd been acting strange since we found that cabin, but now it felt like he was slipping away entirely. Still, neither of us wanted to make a big deal out of it. Not yet. We figured maybe he just needed to clear his head, and we kept telling ourselves that he'd snap out of it. But he didn't. As we hiked through the thick forest, Mark's behavior only got worse. He kept mumbling to himself, his voice too low to make out what he was saying. Every now and then, he would stop in his tracks, looking off into the distance like he was listening to something we couldn't hear. Dan tried to joke around with him, but it was like Mark wasn't even there anymore. His eyes were glazed over, his skin pale, almost sickly. We decided to take a break near a clearing, hoping some food and rest might help. Dan pulled out a protein bar and offered it to Mark, but Mark didn't take it. He just stood there staring at the ground, his hands clenched into fists. I was about to ask him what was going on when he suddenly dropped to his knees and started scratching at the dirt with his bare hands. "Mark, what the hell are you doing?" Dan asked, but Mark didn't respond. He just kept digging, faster and more frantically, like he was searching for something buried deep beneath the earth. Dan and I exchanged a look, and for the first time since the trip started, I felt a cold wave of panic wash over me. This wasn't normal. This wasn't just some case of altitude sickness or exhaustion. I knelt down next to him, grabbing his arm. "Mark, stop. You're freaking us out," I said, but he didn't even flinch. His nails were caked in mud, his breath coming out in short, shallow gasps. And then I saw it. He wasn't just digging aimlessly. He was scratching symbols into the dirt, the same symbols we'd seen in that journal, the same symbols the settler had scrawled in the final pages before he went mad. Dan backed up a few steps, his face pale. "What the hell is this?" he whispered. "Is he possessed or something?" I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that Mark wasn't Mark anymore. He was muttering something under his breath, words I couldn't understand. It sounded like a different language, something old and guttural. I tried to shake him out of it, grabbing him by the shoulders, but he shoved me away with a strength that caught me off guard. He stood up abruptly, his eyes wild, and for the first time since that morning, he spoke clearly. "It's in the valley," he said, his voice trembling with something that felt like fear, or maybe something worse. "It's been here all along, watching us." Dan and I were frozen, unsure of what to do. We'd known Mark for years, and nothing had ever rattled him like this. But now it was like we were standing in front of a stranger. I could feel the weight of the rain pressing down on us, the air thick with something that felt dangerous, something I couldn't name. Before we could even react, Mark took off into the woods, running like his life depended on it. I shouted after him, but he didn't stop. Dan and I bolted after him, stumbling over roots and rocks, the rain blurring our vision. The forest around us seemed darker, the trees thicker, almost as if they were closing in. We ran as fast as we could, but Mark was faster. We could barely keep up, his figure disappearing between the trees. Every now and then we'd catch a glimpse of him just ahead, his movements erratic, frantic, and then nothing. He was gone. Dan and I stopped, gasping for breath, our clothes soaked through. We called out for him, our voices swallowed by the rain and the dense forest, but there was no answer, no sign of him anywhere. It was like he had vanished into thin air. We searched for hours, but Mark was gone, and the forest felt like it had swallowed him whole. And that's when I knew, deep down, that we weren't going to find him. Not the Mark we knew, anyway. The rain never let up. It just kept falling, a steady downpour that blurred the lines between time and place. Dan and I stood there in that clearing for what felt like hours, shouting Mark's name into the thick, suffocating woods. The trees didn't respond. They just loomed over us, their branches heavy with water, dripping relentlessly. Each drop seemed louder than the last, pounding in my ears as we realized how lost we were. Not just in the forest, but in whatever madness had taken hold of Mark. I couldn't shake the images from my mind. Mark, scratching those symbols into the ground with his bare hands, his eyes wild and unfocused, like he wasn't even human anymore. The symbols from that journal. The symbols that the settler had drawn as he descended into madness, convinced that something was watching him, controlling him. I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to think that something like that could be real. But there was no other explanation for what was happening to Mark. As we stood there, drenched and exhausted, Dan spoke up, his voice low. "Do you remember what the journal said? About the illness? The possession?" His words hung in the air, as if saying them out loud made it all too real. I didn't want to remember. I didn't want to think about the way the settler had described the voices, the whispers in the wind, the shadows that followed him wherever he went. But I did. I remembered every word. "I think whatever happened to that guy, it's happening to Mark," Dan continued, his voice shaking. He didn't need to say anything else. We both knew it. We had known it since we found that cabin, even if we hadn't admitted it to ourselves. The signs had been there. Mark's silence, his strange behavior, the way he seemed to be slipping away from us more and more with each passing hour. And now, he was gone. I tried to reason with myself, to come up with a logical explanation. Maybe he'd had some kind of mental break. Maybe the isolation, the rain, the exhaustion had finally gotten to him. But the more I tried to rationalize it, the more I realized how impossible it was to ignore the truth. Something had taken hold of Mark, just like it had taken hold of that settler all those years ago. And now, it was hunting him. Dan and I huddled together under the meager shelter of a rock overhang, the rain still coming down in sheets. Our packs were soaked, our clothes clinging to us, and yet neither of us moved to leave. We couldn't, not without Mark, but deep down I knew we weren't going to find him. Not as he had been, anyway. I thought back to the journal, flipping through the pages in my mind. The settler had written about the valley, about how it was cursed, haunted by something ancient and malevolent. He believed that the illness sweeping through the valley was the work of a demon that fed on the weak, the lost, those who wandered too far into its domain. And once it had them, it didn't let go. The realization hit me like a slow, creeping shadow. Mark hadn't just wandered off. He'd been taken, not physically, not in the way you'd expect, but something had gotten inside his head, inside his soul, and it was using him for its own purpose. The valley wasn't just cursed. It was alive, feeding off the fear, the confusion, the isolation. And now it had claimed Mark. Dan and I sat in silence, neither of us daring to say it out loud. We didn't have to. We both knew what had happened. We both knew that Mark wasn't coming back, not as the person we'd known him to be. And as the rain poured down, I couldn't help but feel that we were next. That whatever had taken Mark was watching us, waiting for its chance to drag us into the same fate. "We need to go," Dan finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. He didn't look at me, just stared out into the trees, the rain falling in heavy drops around us. "We need to get out of here before." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. I knew exactly what he was going to say. "Before it gets us too." Without another word, we stood up, our legs heavy, our bodies exhausted, but we moved. We packed up what little we had left and started heading back the way we came, though neither of us was entirely sure we were even going the right way anymore. The rain had washed away any trail we might have followed, leaving us to navigate through a sea of identical trees and thick underbrush. But even as we stumbled through the woods, calling out for Mark one last time, I knew it was useless. He was gone. Gone to whatever was out there, lurking in the valley, waiting for its next victim. And as the sun began to set behind the thick cloud cover, I couldn't help but wonder if we were already too late. The valley had claimed him, and if we didn't move fast enough, it would claim us too. We never found Mark. The rain had erased all traces of him by the time we finally made it back to the trailhead. Days passed before we got the courage to contact the authorities, but deep down, I knew it wouldn't make a difference. The search teams combed the area for weeks, but there was nothing. No footprints, no gear, not even a sign he had ever been with us. Dan and I stopped talking about what happened. It was easier to pretend it had just been an accident, that Mark had gotten lost and nothing more. But that journal, the way Mark had acted, it stayed with me. Sometimes late at night, I'd replay it all in my head, wondering if there was something we missed, something we could have done. Months later, I caught myself one evening, standing by the window of my apartment, listening. The wind outside whistled low, barely audible, but it reminded me of those whispers in the valley. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us back. I don't go hiking anymore, but every now and then, I still hear those whispers. We pulled up to the campground just as the last bit of light was fading over Devil's Tower. The monument stood there, a jagged silhouette against the evening sky, like a giant watching over us as the sun dipped behind it. My wife and I had been planning this trip for months, a photography road trip across Wyoming, and Devil's Tower was at the top of my list for a sunset shot. I couldn't believe how quiet it was, just the two of us setting up camp, while the sky turned a dull orange and the breeze whispered through the grass. We picked a spot right next to the tree line, the tower looming in the distance, and I set up my camera on the tripod to catch the fading light. There were a few other campers around, but they were far enough away that we felt like we had the place to ourselves. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. As we pitched the tent, the air grew cooler, and I noticed the sky beginning to shift into shades of purple and gray, a hint of rain in the distance. My wife laughed, shaking her head as I fiddled with the camera settings. "You and that camera. Are you ever going to put it down?" she teased, though her eyes were fixed on the tower. She couldn't help but stare at it too. Something about it felt otherworldly. The first few drops of rain started to fall just as I clicked the shutter, capturing the last of the light slipping behind the monument. We hurried to get everything inside the tent as the rain picked up. Light at first, but steady. I smiled as I reviewed the photo on the screen, happy with the shot. By the time we settled in, it was fully dark, the soft patter of rain on the tent roof giving us that perfect camping atmosphere. We sat by the small fire we'd managed to start just before the rain, sipping hot cocoa and listening to the distant sound of wind brushing through the trees. That's when I noticed it for the first time. A light. It was faint, barely visible at first, but as I looked up toward Devil's Tower, I could see something moving. A small flicker, like a lantern swaying back and forth near the base of the monument. I nudged my wife and pointed toward it. She squinted, then shrugged, saying it was probably just another camper with a flashlight, but it felt off. The way it moved so smoothly, almost like it was gliding along the ground. We watched for a few more minutes before dismissing it as nothing and turning in for the night. The rain came down harder as we climbed into our sleeping bags, the tent rustling softly with every gust of wind that swept through the campsite. I lay there, listening, trying to fall asleep, but couldn't shake the image of that light moving in the dark. It seemed harmless enough. Probably just someone hiking around, I told myself. But as the rain drummed steadily on, and the sound of my wife's breathing became the only thing I could hear, I couldn't help but feel like something was watching us. Something out there, just beyond the trees, waiting. The rain had slowed to a drizzle by morning, the air heavy with the smell of wet earth and pine as we stepped out of the tent. My wife stretched and yawned, already talking about the hike we had planned, but my mind was stuck on that strange light from the night before. I glanced over at Devil's Tower, shrouded in mist, and saw no sign of anything unusual. Maybe it really had been another camper, or maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me in the dark. We packed up a small day bag and started our hike, the trail winding through the woods with the monument always looming in the distance. It was peaceful, with only the occasional chirp of birds or the rustle of branches in the wind. But I couldn't shake the feeling from the night before. My eyes kept darting around the trees, expecting to see that flicker of light again, but there was nothing, just the steady drip of rainwater falling from the leaves. By the time we reached the base of the tower, the sky had cleared a bit, but dark clouds still lingered on the horizon. I busied myself with taking photos, focusing on the dramatic rock formations, the sheer cliffs stretching up into the gray sky. My wife wandered around, examining the rock walls and taking in the view. That's when she called out to me. "Hey, come check this out," she said, standing near a cluster of rocks at the edge of the trail. I slung the camera over my shoulder and jogged over to her, expecting it to be some interesting formation or plant. But when I saw what she was pointing at, I stopped in my tracks. It was a small circle of stones, perfectly arranged in the dirt, with what looked like a pile of charred bones in the center. Scattered around were strange carvings etched into the ground, lines and symbols that didn't make any sense. At first, I thought it might have been some kind of old fire pit or campfire someone had made, but the more I looked at it, the less it felt like something innocent. There was a deliberate precision to it, as if whoever had done this had taken their time. Who would do something like this? My wife asked, her voice low. I didn't have an answer. It felt ancient, primal almost. As I knelt to take a closer look, I noticed the charred remains of what looked like a small animal's skull, its hollow eye socket staring back at me. A chill crawled up my spine, and I suddenly felt exposed, like we were intruding on something we shouldn't be part of. "Let's head back," I said, a bit too quickly. My wife gave me a puzzled look, but nodded. As we walked back to camp, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following us. But the trail was empty. Just the steady rain tapping the leaves above and the crunch of our boots on the wet dirt. That night, the light came again. This time it was closer, much closer. We were sitting by the campfire when my wife noticed it first, her voice sharp as she pointed toward the monument. The flicker danced between the trees, moving faster than before, and it wasn't alone. 2, maybe 3 lights, swaying in the dark, circling the base of the tower like they were searching for something, or someone. I stood up, heart racing, and grabbed my camera. My hands fumbled with the settings as I tried to zoom in, But every time I focused, the lights would vanish, only to reappear in a different spot moments later. "They're getting closer," my wife whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackle of the fire. I wanted to say something reassuring, but I couldn't. We both sat there, frozen, watching as the lights crept closer and closer to our campsite. And then, just as suddenly as they'd appeared, they vanished, swallowed by the night. The rain started up again, heavier this time, pounding against the tent as we retreated inside. Neither of us spoke. We didn't have to. The fear hung thick between us, unspoken, as we lay in the dark, listening to the sound of the storm outside, waiting. The rain came down harder as the night wore on, turning the ground outside our tent into a muddy mess. I lay there, staring at the roof of the tent, the rhythmic drumming of rain masking the uneasy silence that had settled between us. My wife was curled up in her sleeping bag, her back to me, but I knew she wasn't asleep either. Neither of us could ignore what was happening anymore. The lights, they had been so close, and the way they moved, there was something deliberate about it, almost like they were watching us, circling, waiting. I tried to rationalize it, thinking it was maybe just some weird local thing, but deep down, I knew it was something more, something we weren't supposed to understand. Then, just as I was starting to drift off, the growling started. It was low at first, barely noticeable over the rain, but as I lay there, it grew louder, rumbling from somewhere in the distance. My eyes snapped open, and I held my breath, straining to hear it through the noise of the storm. There it was again, unmistakable this time, like an animal lurking just beyond the trees. But this wasn't any animal I knew. It sounded too deep, too guttural, like something angry, something hungry. I nudged my wife, whispering her name. She rolled over slowly, her eyes wide and alert, listening to the same sound I was. We didn't need to speak to know we were both thinking the same thing. Whatever it wasn't friendly. The growling came again, louder now, closer. The hair on the back of my neck prickled as I reached for my flashlight, my hand shaking slightly as I fumbled to switch it on. Suddenly, the growling stopped, replaced by a new sound. A rustling like something, or someone, moving through the trees around our campsite. I flicked the flashlight on and aimed it toward the tent flap, but all I could see was the rain pouring down outside, illuminated by the weak beam. My wife sat up beside me, clutching the edge of her sleeping bag, her eyes fixed on the entrance. We both jumped as something scraped against the side of the tent. A long, slow drag, like claws running across the fabric. I whipped the flashlight around, but there was nothing. Just the darkness outside and the sound of the rain pounding the ground. Another scrape, this time closer to the door, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps squelching in the mud. I scrambled to unzip the tent, my mind racing, thinking we needed to get out of there, now. My wife grabbed my arm, her voice urgent. "Wait, listen." I paused, the flashlight beam shaking slightly as I held it out toward the trees. The footsteps had stopped, but in their place the growling had returned. And this time, it wasn't coming from a distance. It was all around us, echoing through the trees surrounding our campsite. And then the lights returned. They flickered into view, one after another, circling us like predators closing in on their prey. My wife let out a sharp breath as one of the lights passed right by the tent, so close I could see the faint glow through the thin fabric. The growling grew louder, more insistent, as if whatever was out there was getting impatient. "We have to go," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the storm. My wife nodded, and together we grabbed what we could. Just the essentials, our phones and the car keys. I reached for the camera but stopped, deciding it wasn't worth it. Not anymore. The light seemed to pulse as we unzipped the tent and stepped out into the rain. It was like stepping into a nightmare. The ground was slick with mud, the trees looming over us like silent sentinels, and the lights, those strange, eerie lights, danced just out of reach, darting between the trees like they were toying with us. We ran. The mud sucked at our boots as we sprinted toward the car, the growling now louder than ever, echoing in every direction. I couldn't tell where it was coming from anymore, or if it was even real. All I knew was that we had to get out of there before whatever was making that sound caught up to us. Just as we reached the car, I felt something. A pull, like hands grabbing at my legs, trying to drag me back into the woods. I stumbled. falling face first into the mud as my wife screamed my name. For a split second, I thought it was over. Whatever was out there had me. But then, as quickly as it had grabbed me, the force let go. My wife pulled me to my feet, her hands gripping my arm as we scrambled into the car, slamming the doors shut behind us. The lights hovered in the trees, watching, waiting. As we sped down the dirt road, the rain blurring everything into a hazy smear of darkness and headlights. We didn't look back. We couldn't. We just drove. We didn't stop driving until we were miles away from the campsite, deep into the next town. The rain still pouring down in sheets across the windshield. My wife was quiet, staring out the window, her fingers gripping the edge of her seat, knuckles white. I pulled into a gas station, my hands trembling slightly as I shut off the engine, the wipers still swishing back and forth, doing little to clear the water now pooling on the glass. We sat there for a long time, the silence between us heavy, the reality of what had just happened sinking in. Neither of us wanted to speak about it, to admit what we'd seen, or to even try and make sense of it, but we couldn't ignore it. We'd been chased by something we couldn't explain. Something that wasn't just a trick of the light. Finally, my wife broke the silence. "What the hell was that?" she asked, her voice low and shaky, but there was an edge of defiance in her tone, like she needed an answer, no matter how impossible. I didn't have one. I leaned back in my seat, my mind racing through everything that had happened since we first arrived at Devil's Tower. The lights, the strange offerings at the campsite, the growling, and that final pull, like something had grabbed me, something physical, something real. It had to be someone, I muttered, more to myself than to her. Someone out there messing with us, trying to scare us off. But even as I said the words, they felt hollow, empty. I knew deep down that whatever had chased us wasn't just a prank. This was something else, something older, more malevolent. We decided to head back to the campsite in the morning, just to retrieve the rest of our gear, though the idea of returning filled me with a gnawing dread I couldn't shake. We booked a cheap motel in the nearest town, trying to shake off the chill that clung to our skin, though neither of us could sleep. Every sound outside, every gust of wind, felt like it was hiding something watching us. Morning came, bringing gray skies and a break in the rain, but the unease remained. As we drove back toward Devil's Tower, I could see my wife glancing at the monument through the window, her expression tight, like she was reliving the events from the night before. I kept my focus on the road, trying not to think about the lights, about whatever had tried to drag me back into the woods. When we arrived, the campsite was just as we'd left it, muddy and soaked from the storm, but empty. There were no signs of anything unusual. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing that could explain the growling or the lights. It was as if we had imagined the whole thing, but we both knew we hadn't. I walked over to the spot where we had first seen the ritualistic offerings, hoping to find some kind of clue. Maybe someone had set it up to scare campers off, or it was part of some weird local tradition. But as I knelt down and traced my fingers over the strange carvings in the dirt, a memory flashed in my mind. Those symbols. They were the same ones I'd seen in the old campsite, the one with the bones and the perfect circle of stones. It hit me then. The offerings weren't just random. They were part of something ancient, something tied to the land. A ritual, maybe. Something meant to summon or ward off whatever was stalking us. I stood up, brushing the dirt from my hands, my mind racing with the realization. We weren't the first to experience this. As we packed up the rest of our things, I couldn't stop thinking about the strange, old symbols and the way the lights had moved, as if they were looking for something, or someone. Whoever had set up that campsite had known about the lights, known about whatever lived near Devil's Tower, and had left those offerings to keep it at bay. But why had the lights come after us? What had we done to draw them closer each night? As we threw the last of our bags into the trunk, my wife stopped, her eyes narrowing as she looked back toward the trees. "Do you think we disturbed something?" she asked, her voice hushed, like speaking it aloud would make it real. I didn't answer, because I already knew. We'd crossed a line, maybe by exploring the old campsite, maybe just by being there. And whatever was out there had noticed, it had followed us, tried to drag us into the woods, maybe to make us part of its ritual. We got into the car, neither of us saying another word as we drove away from Devil's Tower for the last time. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching, waiting, just out of sight. We didn't talk much on the drive home. The closer we got to leaving Wyoming behind, the more it felt like the events at Devil's Tower were slipping into the past, like a half-forgotten nightmare. But the memory of those lights still flickered in the back of my mind, and I knew it was the same for my wife. Every time we looked at each other, it was there, unspoken. A few weeks later, I went through the photos from the trip. Most of them were just what you'd expect. Scenic shots of landscapes, wildlife, the usual. But when I scrolled through the images from that last night at Devil's Tower, something stopped me cold. There, in the background of one of the shots, barely visible, was a faint, glowing light near the base of the monument. I zoomed in, my pulse quickening. It wasn't just a light. It was a cluster of lights, swirling together in a pattern I recognized too well. I didn't show it to my wife. I didn't want to drag it all back up again, not when we'd worked so hard to put it behind us. But every so often, I catch myself thinking about that night, about the lights, the growling, and whatever it was that had grabbed me in the woods. I wonder if anyone else has seen them, if anyone else has been chased like we were. I'll never go back to Devil's Tower. I don't care what anyone says. Whatever we encountered out there, it wasn't meant to be found. And it's still out there, waiting for the next unlucky soul to stumble across those offerings. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind picks up and the rain starts to fall, I swear I can still hear the faint echo of those chants. The first time I took the job at the outpost, I thought it would be peaceful. Nothing but open skies and endless stretches of snow-covered wilderness. The kind of solitude I'd been craving after years of city noise. At first, it was exactly that. The crew was small, just 4 of us, keeping the outpost running in the middle of nowhere, Alaska. The isolation was intense, but we had our routines. The generator whirred in the background. The sound of the wind battering the small building was constant, and there wasn't much else to do but work and wait for our shifts to end. The outpost itself was more of a glorified shack, cobbled together with old wood and metal panels. We had all the essentials: heat, food, and enough gear to get through the worst storms. But that was it. The place had been here for decades, long before any of us showed up. There were stories, of course. Nothing dramatic, just old tales passed down from crew to crew about strange things people saw or heard while out on patrols. I always figured it was boredom getting the best of them. But after a while, I started noticing things. It was subtle at first, just little oddities. One evening, while I was finishing up a routine patrol, something caught my eye in the distance. It was out near the tree line, barely visible in the falling snow. A shadow. I thought it might be an animal, but it was too tall, too still. When I turned back to look, it was gone. I stood there for a moment, staring at the spot, half expecting it to come back, but the only movement was the steady fall of snow. By the time I got back to the outpost, the others were already inside, sitting around the small stove we used to cook and keep warm. I mentioned what I'd seen, but they laughed it off. "Just the wilderness playing tricks," one of them said, shaking his head. I tried to laugh along with them, but something about it felt off. Still, I pushed it to the back of my mind. It was probably nothing. That's what I kept telling myself anyway. For the next few days, everything seemed normal again. We'd work, take shifts on patrol, and spend the evenings talking or reading, passing the time however we could. The outpost was a quiet, lonely place, especially in the evenings. You'd sit there listening to the wind, the occasional creak of the old walls, and the soft patter of snow hitting the roof. But after a while, I started thinking about that shadow again. It was such a fleeting moment, but it stuck with me. I couldn't help but glance out the window more often than usual, just to make sure there was nothing out there. The nights were the worst. When everything went still, and the snow muffled every sound, you'd start to feel like you were the only person left on the planet. And that's when it would happen again. I'd catch a glimpse of something just at the edge of the trees, standing there in the half-light, always watching. But whenever I blinked or looked directly at it, there'd be nothing there. Just darkness, snow, and the endless stretch of forest. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks, but the feeling wouldn't go away. I never said anything to the others again, but I knew something wasn't right. Something was out there, and it was watching. A few nights after I saw that shadow again, the weather took a turn. The wind picked up, carrying with it the sharp bite of rain mixed with sleet, tapping against the windows in uneven rhythms. It was the kind of storm that made everything feel smaller, like the world outside the outpost didn't exist anymore, swallowed up by the dark. I sat with the others, all of us crammed into the small common area, just trying to pass the time. We didn't talk much when it rained like that. It was as if the storm had a way of pulling the conversation out of the air. That's when the older guy, Blake, started talking about the legends. Blake had been coming to the outpost for years, long before the rest of us showed up. He'd seen his fair share of odd things out in the wilderness, or so he claimed. "Ever heard of the horned figure?" he asked, leaning forward as if he was about to share a secret. We hadn't. He grinned, but there was no humor behind it, just something unsettling. "Local legend," he continued. "But the thing is, it's more than that. The story's been around for centuries. Something about a demon tied to the land, cursed by the people who lived here before the settlers came." We all laughed it off at first. It was the kind of story you'd tell around a campfire, meant to spook people, nothing more. But Blake didn't laugh. "You don't have to believe me," he said, his voice low, "but people have seen things out here. Big things. Horns, shadows, figures that shouldn't be there. And every time, someone disappears." The storm outside seemed to intensify as he spoke, the rain hammering harder against the roof. I couldn't help but glance out the window, just for a second. The darkness beyond the glass felt more oppressive than usual, but I didn't see anything. The conversation moved on after that, but I couldn't shake what Blake had said. That night, as I lay in my bunk listening to the rain, I kept thinking about the shadow I'd seen. It hadn't had horns, but then again, I hadn't gotten a clear look. I told myself it was all in my head, just Blake's stories messing with me. But the next day, the strange thing started happening again. During my patrol, I found footprints in the snow near the edge of the trees. At first, I thought they belonged to one of the others, but they were too big and the stride was too long. I followed them for a few yards, but they disappeared as suddenly as they'd appeared, like something had stepped in from nowhere and vanished just as quickly. Later, back at the outpost, I brought it up with the crew. They shrugged it off. Blake gave me a knowing look but said nothing. I started seeing more of them. Large, deep footprints, always at the edge of the trees, never too close to the outpost. Each time I went out, they'd be there, as if something or someone was pacing just beyond my line of sight. The others acted like it was no big deal, but I knew they were getting nervous too. Blake, especially, seemed quieter, more withdrawn. There was a growing tension in the air, something unspoken that we all felt but didn't want to acknowledge. It was like we were waiting for something to happen, and the rain never seemed to stop. Every night it poured, drumming against the roof, making the outpost feel even more cut off from the rest of the world. We'd sit in silence, listening to the storm, each of us lost in our own thoughts. And out there, beyond the rain, the shadows were still watching. The rain was relentless that night, coming down in sheets so thick it blurred the line between the sky and the ground. It was my turn for the late patrol, and by then, none of us really joked about going outside anymore. We all felt it, something waiting just beyond the light of the outpost. The door creaked as I stepped out into the downpour, pulling my hood tight against the cold sting of rain. The wind howled, and the lights from the outpost barely cut through the darkness. I kept my head down, focusing on the beam of my flashlight sweeping across the ground. Footprints. Larger and clearer than before, pressed deep into the muddy earth, leading from the edge of the forest to the outpost, then stopping abruptly. As if something had been standing there, watching us. My chest tightened, but I forced myself to follow them, knowing it was the only way to make sense of what had been happening. Each step felt heavier, the rain pounding harder, and the wind pushing against me like a physical force. I followed the trail toward the tree line, the shadows of the forest stretching long and twisted in the dim light. That's when I saw it. Standing at the edge of the trees, barely visible through the rain, a figure. It was tall, too tall to be a person, with long, twisted limbs and something rising from its head. Horns. They curved upward like the branches of a dead tree, and the figure stood perfectly still, facing me, though I couldn't make out any details of its face. I froze, feeling every instinct telling me to turn back, but my feet stayed planted in the wet ground. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there like a dark statue, waiting. I took a step forward, my flashlight trembling in my hand, trying to get a better look. And then, in the next blink, it was gone. I whipped the light back and forth, searching the trees, but there was nothing. Just the endless rain and the cold emptiness of the forest. I stumbled back to the outpost, my thoughts racing, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. When I burst through the door, the others were sitting around the small stove, their faces pale. Before I could say anything, Blake stood up, his eyes wide. "We need to leave," he said, his voice steady but low. He had never been one to panic, and that made his words all the more unsettling. "What are you talking about?" one of the others asked, clearly rattled by Blake's sudden urgency. "I've seen it before," Blake continued, his gaze locking with mine. "Years ago. Same outpost, same storm, same thing. I don't know what it is, but I know we're not safe here anymore." The room fell silent, the weight of his words sinking in. We all felt it, the sense that whatever was out there wasn't going to stay at the edge of the trees much longer. I told them about the figure I'd seen, the horns, the way it disappeared into the storm. No one doubted me this time. "We can't leave now," one of the crew said, glancing out the window at the storm. "Not in this. It's suicide." Blake shook his head, grabbing his coat and boots. "Staying here is worse," he said, pulling his hood up. Before anyone could argue, Blake was already at the door, yanking it open and stepping out into the rain. We hesitated for only a moment before following him, the cold wind slamming into us as we left the safety of the outpost. The plan was simple: make it to the snowmobiles, get as far away from the outpost as possible, and figure things out later. But as we made our way through the storm, I felt it again, that sense of being watched. I looked back toward the outpost, and that's when I saw them. Not one figure, but several, standing at the edge of the forest, their twisted forms barely visible in the rain, horns rising from their heads, all of them watching us, unmoving. The others must have seen them too, because no one said a word, but we all started moving faster, our boots sinking into the mud, our breath coming out in ragged bursts. The figures didn't follow. They didn't need to. It felt like we were being herded, pushed toward something we couldn't see, but we didn't stop. The snowmobiles were just ahead, covered in rain, our only way out of this nightmare. But as we reached them, the wind picked up and something roared in the distance, not like an animal, but something deeper, older. I looked back once more. The figures were gone, but I knew they were still out there, waiting. The roar echoed through the storm, a sound that felt too real to be just the wind. We all froze for a moment, standing by the snowmobiles, unsure of what to do next. Blake was the first to snap out of it, fumbling with the keys in his coat pocket. "We're getting out of here now," he said, his voice shaking just enough to make me realize how bad things had become. I kept glancing back toward the tree line, half expecting to see those figures moving through the rain again, but all I saw was the endless stretch of blackness, swirling with the storm. Blake revved up the engine on the first snowmobile, and the sound cut through the air like a lifeline. One of the others jumped on behind him, while the rest of us hurried to the remaining snowmobiles, trying to start them as fast as possible. But the storm seemed to be pressing in, making every movement harder, slower. I struggled to get my snowmobile running, feeling the pressure mounting with each second. Just as the engine finally sputtered to life, there was a flash of movement at the edge of my vision. I looked up, and there it was again, the figure, standing at the far end of the clearing, barely visible through the rain, its twisted horns rising out of the darkness. It was closer now, and I could see more detail this time. The body was misshapen, elongated in ways that didn't make sense. And its eyes, if they were eyes, were just hollow pits staring in my direction. Blake must have seen it too, because he shouted, "Go! Now!" The roar came again, louder this time, and I felt something shift in the air around us. We sped off, the snowmobiles tearing through the wet ground, but even with the engines blaring, I could still hear that sound. I didn't look back. None of us did. The landscape blurred by as we pushed through the storm, the wind and rain slashing at our faces, but it felt like we weren't moving fast enough. Every time I thought we'd gain some distance, I'd catch a glimpse of something in the trees, a shadow, a flash of horns, the sense that we were being followed. We didn't speak. There was nothing to say. It was just about getting away, putting as much distance between us and that place as possible. After what felt like hours, we finally reached a ridge that overlooked the valley below. The storm had let up slightly, and for the first time I dared to look back. The outpost was far behind us now, barely visible through the mist and rain, but even from that distance I could see the dark figures standing at the edge of the tree line, still watching, still waiting. It hit me then. Whatever we had seen, whatever we had disturbed, it wasn't bound to the outpost. It was bound to the land itself. Blake pulled up next to me, his face pale and soaked with rain. He didn't say anything at first, just stared out over the ridge, his eyes fixed on the distant figures. "We were never meant to be here," he finally muttered, almost to himself. I didn't understand at first, but as I followed his gaze, something clicked. The cave, the carvings. They weren't just ancient marks on stone, they were a warning that we'd ignored. We disturbed something. Blake continued, his voice barely audible over the wind. "Something that's been here long before any of us." I wanted to argue, to say it was all in our heads, just a series of coincidences brought on by fear and isolation. But deep down, I knew he was right. We'd unleashed something, and now it was awake. The others pulled up behind us, engines still idling, but no one spoke. We all knew it. Blake was the first to break the silence. "We need to keep moving," he said, his voice steady but grim. "Whatever it is, it's not going to stop." And that was the truth of it. It wasn't just the outpost anymore, it was everything around us, the wilderness, the land, the storm itself. As we revved the engines and prepared to leave the ridge, I caught one last glimpse of the figures in the distance. They hadn't moved, but I could feel their presence, lingering, watching. It wasn't going to let us go easily, and we'd never find out what we had truly awakened. We made it back to civilization the next morning, soaked to the bone and running on pure adrenaline. None of us spoke about what we'd seen. There was nothing to explain it, and frankly, we didn't want to try. Blake left first, disappearing without a word, his truck kicking up dust as it pulled away from the small town we'd taken refuge in. The rest of us scattered soon after, each heading in different directions, but the weight of what happened stayed with me. I tried to push it out of my mind, but every time I closed my eyes, I'd see those figures standing in the rain, watching. Weeks passed, and life moved on, but the memories never faded. Sometimes, when the rain hits my window just right, I think I hear that roar in the distance, and I wonder if whatever we disturbed out there is still waiting, or if it followed us back. I was halfway across Kansas when the tornado hit. The storm had come on fast, tearing across the horizon like something out of an apocalyptic movie. One minute, I was driving under a patch of darkening sky, and the next, everything around me had been swallowed by swirling chaos. The only thing on my mind was finding somewhere, anywhere, to wait it out. The road stretched out endlessly, nothing but flat fields on both sides, broken up occasionally by old, weather-beaten farmhouses. After what felt like hours of dodging debris and hoping the twister wasn't about to tear my car apart, I saw it. A farmhouse standing alone on the horizon, battered but still there. I pulled over and ran towards it, feeling a strange sense of relief at the sight of shelter, even though something about the place felt off. The house wasn't exactly welcoming. The paint had peeled away in large chunks, leaving it a patchwork of grayed wood and forgotten memories. The windows were clouded, like they hadn't been cleaned in decades. I hesitated at the door, staring at the brass handle that had somehow managed to stay shiny despite the decay around it. Something about the contrast unsettled me, but I was desperate, so I turned the knob and stepped inside. The moment I crossed the threshold, I felt it. The air was thick, too still for a house that had just weathered a tornado outside. There was an odd scent too, like burnt wood, but nothing inside was charred or broken. Dust hung in the beams of fading evening light, and every footstep I took echoed louder than it should have in the silence. I wandered through the small entryway into what must have been the living room once upon a time. A large, worn-out couch sat in the center, untouched, its upholstery faded, but otherwise intact. Pictures on the walls stared back at me, their frames crooked as if someone had knocked into them, but never bothered to straighten them. In the dim light, I couldn't make out the faces, but I wasn't in the mood to examine them too closely. I tried the light switch out of habit, but of course, nothing happened. I pulled out my phone to use as a flashlight, grateful it still had some charge left. That's when I noticed it, the strange symbols etched into the walls, barely noticeable in the failing light. They weren't like anything I'd ever seen. Odd, angular shapes, almost like someone had scratched them in a hurry. Some were deep, like they'd been carved in with a knife, while others were shallow, like a finger tracing over wood. I told myself it was probably just vandalism, kids messing around with an old place. But then I saw the marks upstairs, identical to the ones below. They were everywhere, along the walls, on the doors, even on the ceiling. That's when the first gust of wind hit the house, rattling the windows but not breaking them. The tornado wasn't far off, and the howling outside was growing louder. I figured I'd hole up in one of the rooms upstairs, away from the windows, and wait for it to pass. I found a small bedroom at the end of the hall, the bed still made like someone had just left for the day. I settled in, the noise of the storm growing stronger as night started to fall. The wind whipped through the trees outside, but the house felt eerily still. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The storm outside seemed relentless as the evening slowly bled into night. The farmhouse groaned under the force of the wind, but the eerie stillness inside remained. I sat on the edge of the bed, phone in hand, watching the battery drain faster than I'd like. Every now and then, the wind would lash against the walls, but it felt like the house wasn't entirely part of the storm, like it was somehow separated from the chaos just beyond its doors. That's when I noticed it again, the strange smell, stronger this time. It wasn't just burnt wood anymore. There was something else mixed in, something metallic. I couldn't place it, but it was there, faint yet unmistakable. I thought maybe it was coming from the hallway, so I stood up and made my way back out of the room, my phone casting a dim glow on the floorboards as I moved. The wind outside howled, rattling the door frames and pushing at the windows, but inside, the air remained disturbingly still. I followed the smell down the narrow hallway, pausing in front of a door that looked like it led to the basement. The door was slightly ajar, as if someone had forgotten to close it all the way. I don't know why, but I felt drawn to it, like something was urging me to go down there. I pushed the door open fully, the hinges creaking loudly in the quiet. A narrow staircase led into the darkness below. I hesitated for a moment, my instincts telling me to stay upstairs where it felt safer, but curiosity got the better of me. I made my way down, the steps creaking under my weight, until I reached the basement floor. It was colder down here, much colder than it had any right to be. My phone's light flickered over old, forgotten furniture covered in dust and cobwebs. The smell was stronger now, almost suffocating in its intensity. That's when I saw it, buried beneath an old, broken table. An old diary, its leather cover cracked and worn with age. I hesitated before picking it up, unsure why anyone would have left something like this down here, but eventually, my curiosity won out. I flipped it open, the pages yellowed and brittle. The handwriting was hard to read at first, shaky and uneven, but as I skimmed through, I realized this wasn't just any journal. It was a record of the people who had once lived in this farmhouse. The early entries were mundane, complaints about failing crops, talk of long winters and droughts. But as I kept reading, the tone shifted. The author began to mention strange occurrences on their land. Dead animals found near the fields, strange winds that would come out of nowhere and destroy whatever progress they had made. The entries grew more frantic as the days passed, until one in particular caught my attention. It described a night much like this one. Violent winds, a storm that seemed like it would never end. The author wrote about finding symbols carved into the walls, symbols they claimed were meant to summon something. Something dark and ancient that could save their farm from ruin. But there was a price, a blood price. And as I read those words, a chill ran through me. I couldn't stop myself from flipping through more pages, my heart racing as I read about the pact the family made. They had summoned a demon to protect their land, offering a sacrifice in return for its protection. And now, every time a storm of this magnitude hit, the demon came to collect. I slammed the diary shut, my mind racing with disbelief. It couldn't be true, right? This was just a story, some kind of sick joke someone had left behind. But then, as if in response to my doubt, the wind outside intensified, slamming against the house so hard I thought the walls might give way. I ran back upstairs, the diary still clutched in my hand. The house felt smaller now, like it was closing in around me. The symbols on the walls seemed to glow faintly in the dim light, and I could swear I heard faint whispers carried on the wind. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, that the storm was playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. Something was waiting. The wind outside had reached a fever pitch, slamming against the house like an invisible force trying to break through. It wasn't just wind anymore. It was more deliberate, more menacing, as if it knew I was inside, as if it was searching for something. My grip tightened around the diary, the words about the blood price echoing in my mind like a warning I didn't want to believe. The farmhouse that once seemed like a refuge now felt like a trap. I stumbled back into the living room, the windows rattling violently in their frames. The symbols etched into the walls seemed more vivid now, as if they were coming alive under the pressure of the storm. I could hear the wind howling outside, but there was something else mixed in with it. Voices, faint, but unmistakable. They weren't calling my name, but they were saying something, over and over again, in a language I couldn't understand. My first instinct was to leave, to run out of the house and into the storm, but I knew the tornado was still out there, somewhere close. I'd be safer inside, or at least that's what I kept telling myself. But the walls were closing in on me, and every second I stayed, the house felt more alive, more hostile. I thought maybe if I hid, it would pass. Maybe if I ignored the diary, the symbols, the strange voices, the wind would die down and I'd be left with nothing but a bad memory. I ran to the kitchen, hoping to find a place to hunker down until it was over. That's when I heard it, a loud crash from upstairs like something heavy had fallen. My stomach lurched, dread building in the pit of my chest. It was impossible. There was nothing up there, no one, and yet I heard the footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming down the stairs. I froze, waiting for the next sound, praying it was just the wind playing tricks on my mind. But the footsteps didn't stop. They grew louder, closer, echoing through the empty hallway. I moved toward the back door, ready to make a break for it, but as I reached for the handle, the door slammed shut on its own. I tried to yank it open, but it wouldn't budge. It was like the house had sealed me in, trapping me inside as the storm raged outside. Panic surged through me. I ran for the front door, but it too was stuck, as if the house itself had locked me in. The wind outside roared even louder now, shaking the entire farmhouse to its core. I could hear the faint whispers again, carried by the wind, growing louder, more insistent. I looked around frantically, my mind racing for a solution. That's when I remembered the symbols, the ones carved into the walls, the ones the diary said were part of the ritual. Maybe if I destroyed them, the wind would stop. Maybe the house would let me go. I grabbed the nearest object I could find, a rusted old fireplace poker, and started scraping at the walls, tearing through the strange markings as fast as I could. But as I did, the wind grew stronger. The house shook so violently that the pictures fell off the walls, the floorboards beneath me groaning under the pressure. I could feel it now, Something was coming for me. Something ancient, something angry. The voices outside were louder than ever, shouting over the wind in that same unfamiliar language. It felt like the entire house was alive, like it was breathing, like it was waiting for me to fail. Suddenly, the windows shattered all at once, glass exploding inward as the wind forced its way inside. I stumbled back, barely avoiding the shards, and watched in horror as the symbols on the walls began to glow a deep, angry red. The house wasn't just holding me in, it was offering me up. The floorboards beneath me started to buckle, the entire structure groaning under the weight of the storm. I ran to the center of the room, hoping to find some corner, some space that would shield me from the destruction. But the walls themselves were closing in. And then, in the midst of it all, I heard the voices clearly for the first time. Not whispers, but screams, demanding one thing. They wanted the blood price. The storm wasn't just outside anymore, it was inside, and it wanted me. The wind crashed through the shattered windows, swirling around the room like a living thing. The voices were deafening now, no longer just faint whispers, but a chorus of demands, all centered on me. It wasn't just the storm outside anymore. It was the house itself, coming, alive, feeding off the pact that had been made long ago. My mind was racing, trying to piece it all together, but the truth was sinking in fast. This wasn't just a freak storm, and I wasn't just some unlucky traveler caught in the wrong place. The symbols, the diary, the unnatural stillness of the house, they were all part of the same thing. A bargain had been struck here, one that demanded a sacrifice when the storm returned. And now, that debt had come due. I looked down at the diary still clutched in my hand, my fingers gripping it tightly, like it was the only thing tethering me to reality. The words echoed in my mind, the desperate scribbles of the previous owner, describing how they'd called on something dark to protect their land from ruin. The crops had flourished, the droughts had ended, but in exchange, the demon demanded payment every time the winds came, a blood price to keep the land fertile. It all made sense now. The family had survived on the strength of this pact, but it had cost them everything in the end. One by one, they had been claimed by the storm, dragged into the wind's fury, leaving only these hollow walls behind. And now, the house had chosen me to continue the cycle. As I stood there, the wind swirling around me, I realized that the voices weren't just demanding, they were taunting me. They wanted me to understand what was happening. They wanted me to know that I had become part of this nightmare. The house wasn't going to let me go until I paid the same price the others had. Desperation clawed at me. I looked around the room, my eyes falling on the remnants of the house, the broken furniture, the shattered glass, the glowing symbols etched into the walls. There had to be a way out, something I could do to break the hold this place had over me. I remembered the symbols, the ones I had tried to destroy. Maybe if I could finish what I started, if I could erase them all, the pact would be broken. The storm might leave and I could escape this cursed place. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized the truth. The pact wasn't in the symbols or even in the diary. It was in the land itself, tied to the blood that had been spilled here, tied to the very wind that was now closing in on me. Destroying the symbols wouldn't change anything. The storm had come for its due, and nothing I did would stop it from taking what it was owed. The walls trembled violently as the wind slammed into them, and I knew I was running out of time. The voices were louder now, almost mocking, daring me to try and escape. But deep down, I knew there was no escape. The storm was going to claim me, just like it had claimed the others. I glanced at the front door, still locked tight, and then at the shattered windows, the wind rushing in with more force than ever. My only option was to run, to make a break for it, and hope that the storm wouldn't tear me apart before I made it outside. With a final look at the glowing symbols on the walls, I bolted for the window, throwing myself through the jagged glass and into the chaos outside. The wind hit me like a freight train, nearly knocking me off my feet, but I pushed forward, stumbling across the field as the farmhouse loomed behind me. I could hear the voices still, screaming in the wind, growing fainter as I moved farther from the house, but they weren't done with me yet. The storm wasn't done with me yet. I ran until I couldn't hear the voices anymore, until the wind seemed like any other storm, violent but impersonal, no longer directed at me. I didn't look back at the farmhouse. I couldn't. The moment I broke free from its grasp, it felt like something was watching me from inside, waiting for me to return. But I wasn't going back. Hours passed before I found the road again, the storm slowly fading behind me. I was battered, cut from the glass, but I was alive. The farmhouse, the symbols, the voices, none of it felt real anymore, like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. But I knew it had happened. The diary, the pact, the demon wind, it had all been real, and I had barely escaped with my life. Weeks later, I still couldn't shake the feeling that the storm wasn't over, that the farmhouse wasn't done with me. Every time a gust of wind blew against my window at night, I was taken back to that moment, standing inside that cursed place, waiting for something ancient and dark to claim me. One day, I noticed a scar on my arm, a small, jagged mark. I don't remember getting it that night, but it's there, a faint reminder of the symbols etched into the walls. Part of me wonders if it's a warning, that maybe the wind hasn't forgotten about me. We arrived at the salt flats just before the sun began to set, the light stretching across the endless landscape like something out of a dream. Everything around us was flat, stark white, and eerily quiet, a place where sound seemed to get lost in the air, swallowed by the emptiness that went on for miles. The documentary crew I was with, 4 of us in total, was focused on capturing that isolation, the sheer emptiness of it all, for our project about disappearing landscapes in the American West. It had rained earlier that afternoon, leaving patches of water across the salt-crusted ground, tiny mirrors reflecting the sky and making the horizon blur into itself. The rest of the crew was busy unpacking gear from the van, and I wandered off, not far, just a few hundred feet, to take in the view from a different angle. That's when I saw it. A circle of stones, maybe 10 feet across, neatly arranged as if someone had placed them there deliberately. At first, it didn't strike me as anything strange. I figured it was some kind of art installation, a leftover from one of the many photographers or travelers that passed through the flats over the years. But as I moved closer, I could see the symbols etched into the salt beneath the stones. They weren't anything I recognized. Sharp lines, intersecting triangles, shapes that looked almost like runes or something out of an ancient script, but none of it made sense. I called the others over, waving for them to come take a look, half expecting them to laugh it off or tell me it was nothing. But when they saw it, they were as puzzled as I was. No one could explain it, and no one had an idea of what it could be, though Ryan, our sound guy, suggested maybe it was part of some abandoned set, or something used for a desert shoot. We all kind of shrugged it off and went back to setting up the camp. But the image of those stones stuck with me, burned into the back of my mind as the evening dragged on. By the time we finished getting the tents up and started a small fire to cook dinner, it was dark, and the rain started falling again, softly at first, then picking up as the wind began to sweep across the flats. I stayed close to the fire, watching the others work with the cameras, testing the angles for tomorrow's shoot, but every now and then, my eyes would drift back to the circle of stones. It was still there, just a shadowy shape in the distance, barely visible in the dim light of our lanterns, but there was something about it that seemed to tug at my attention, something I couldn't quite explain. The rain was relentless, a steady drizzle that soaked everything in a thin, cold layer, making the ground slick and muddy in patches where the salt hadn't fully dried from the earlier storm. We huddled around the fire, trying to keep warm as the night pressed in on all sides, the vast expanse of the flats disappearing into the darkness, leaving only the small circle of our camp's glow. Ryan kept fiddling with the sound equipment, muttering about interference he couldn't quite figure out, blaming the weather, the moisture in the air, or maybe just bad luck with the gear. I was distracted though, my mind still on those stones, on the strange markings we couldn't explain, and every now and then I thought I saw something out of the corner of my eye, just beyond the fire's light. But when I turned to look, there was nothing there. The others noticed too. Tara, our director, mentioned it once, a quick comment about the shadows playing tricks on her. but no one made much of it. Still, the unease settled in slowly, creeping over us like the rain, drenching us without our realizing it until it was too late to shake off. Around midnight, we all decided to turn in, tired from the day's work and ready to get some sleep before the big shoot tomorrow. That's when the first strange thing happened. One of the cameras, set up just outside the tents to catch time-lapse footage of the night sky, suddenly flickered, the lights on the side flashing erratically before it shut down completely. Ryan cursed under his breath and went over to check it out, thinking it was just a loose battery or a glitch from the rain, but when he tried to restart it, the screen stayed dark, refusing to power back on. "Must have gotten wet," he said, but there was an edge to his voice, like he didn't quite believe his own explanation. We decided to call it a night after that, figuring we'd sort it out in the morning. But as we headed to our tents, I glanced back at the circle of stones one last time. I could have sworn it looked different, like the shadows had shifted somehow. The stones rearranged in a subtle way that didn't make sense. I blinked, shook my head, and told myself it was just the darkness playing tricks. But that nagging feeling of something being wrong settled deep into my chest as I crawled into my sleeping bag. I didn't sleep much after that. Just lay there listening to the rain against the tent, my mind spinning with half-formed thoughts about the symbols, the stones, and the strange shadows on the horizon. I must have dozed off at some point because I woke to the sound of voices outside the tent, muffled at first, like someone was having a quiet conversation. But there was something off about it. I unzipped the flap just enough to peek out, expecting to see Ryan or Tara standing by the fire, but the camp was empty. The rain had stopped, leaving the ground wet and shiny, reflecting the faint glow of our lanterns, but there was no one in sight. That's when I noticed Sarah wasn't in her tent. Her gear was still there, her boots by the entrance, but no sign of her anywhere. A wave of confusion hit me. Where would she go in the middle of the night, barefoot in the dark, without telling anyone? I stepped outside, calling her name softly at first, not wanting to wake the others. But when she didn't respond, I got louder. Still nothing. I grabbed a flashlight and walked toward the stone circle, hoping she hadn't wandered off toward it. I couldn't explain why, but the thought of her near those stones sent a shiver through me. The stones loomed ahead, barely visible under the overcast sky, but as I got closer, I saw movement, a dark shape standing just beyond the circle. I froze, flashlight beam trembling slightly as it cut through the foggy air. It wasn't Sarah. The figure stood still, its outline barely distinguishable, as though it was part of the night itself. I tried to call out, but my voice faltered, caught somewhere between my throat and the open air, as if the very atmosphere was pushing back against me. Then the figure moved, not walking, but almost gliding along the ground, its shape shifting as it passed between the stones, each one seeming to pulse with a faint reddish glow I hadn't noticed before. I took a step back, my heart hammering as the figure vanished into the darkness, leaving behind nothing but the faintest whisper of movement in the damp air. Suddenly, Sarah's voice echoed from behind me, distant and disoriented, calling out weakly from the far side of camp. I spun around, flashlight swinging wildly as I ran toward the sound, stumbling over the uneven ground, the beam cutting through the mist as I shouted her name. When I found her, she was standing by the edge of camp, her back to me, staring out toward the salt flats, her body rigid, hands hanging limply at her sides. I reached her, grabbing her shoulder, and she turned to face me, but her eyes were wide and unfocused, her lips moving as if she was whispering something, but no sound came out. "What happened? Where did you go?" I asked, but she didn't answer. She just stared past me, her gaze fixed on the horizon, as though she was seeing something I couldn't. I dragged her back to camp, shaking her gently, trying to snap her out of whatever trance she was in, but she kept muttering under her breath, a string of unintelligible words that sent a chill down my spine. Ryan and Tara stumbled out of their tents, groggy and confused, asking what was going on, but I couldn't explain it. Sarah's eyes finally focused, blinking rapidly as if waking from a dream, and she whispered, "It's still out there." None of us knew what she meant, but there was something in her voice that made us all look back toward the stones, searching for answers we knew we wouldn't find. The night stretched on, the shadows from the flats growing longer, darker, almost as if they were creeping toward us, feeding off the fear that clung to the air. We huddled around the fire for the rest of the night, no one saying much, but every now and then Sarah would glance toward the horizon, her eyes wide and glassy, as if she expected something to emerge from the darkness and come for us. The dawn broke with a dull gray light, but the heaviness of the night still lingered around us, like a weight we couldn't shake. We were exhausted. None of us had slept after what happened with Sarah, and the unease had settled deep in our bones. She was still quiet, sitting by the smoldering remains of the fire, staring at the ground as if lost in thought, occasionally glancing toward the stone circle that seemed to pulse with an energy none of us could fully understand. Ryan suggested packing up early, but there was a strange reluctance to leave, as if none of us wanted to be the first to admit how unsettled we all were. I walked over to Sarah, trying again to get her to explain what happened the night before, hoping for some kind of clarity, but when I asked where she had gone, her face twisted in confusion. "I don't know. I just walked," she said, her voice thin, like it was coming from somewhere far away. She told us she didn't remember leaving the camp, didn't remember the stones or the figure I had seen near them. All she could recall was waking up near the edge of the flats, her feet cold and wet, the horizon stretching out in front of her like an endless void. Her words sent a chill through me, and for a moment, everything about the night before rushed back. The shadows, the stones, the strange figure that had disappeared into the darkness. Tara, who had been unusually silent, finally spoke up. "What if we weren't supposed to be here?" she asked, almost as if talking to herself. We all looked at her, waiting for her to explain, and she hesitated, her eyes darting between us and the stones. "I mean, look at it. What if we disturbed something? Ancient?" she continued, her voice barely a whisper. It was the first time any of us had voiced the thought that had been quietly gnawing at us since we'd arrived. The symbols on the ground, the eerie atmosphere, the way everything seemed to shift when you weren't looking directly at it. Ryan scoffed at the idea, trying to shake off the tension, but even he couldn't deny that something was wrong. I couldn't help but remember the stories we'd told on the drive up about the old legends tied to the salt flats, tales of disappearances, of travelers lost to the land, swallowed whole by the endless expanse. What if those weren't just stories? I glanced back at the stone circle, suddenly seeing it for what it truly was. A place of ritual, a site meant to hold something in, or maybe keep something out, and we had unknowingly crossed into it, disrupting whatever force lay dormant beneath the surface. Sarah, still pale and distant, spoke up again, her voice barely audible. "I saw something out there. It wasn't human." We all turned to her, her words hanging in the air like an accusation, daring us to challenge them, but none of us could. Her eyes were wide, dark circles beneath them, and she looked like someone who had glimpsed something far beyond her understanding. There was no more debate after that. We started packing, moving quickly and without speaking, our minds racing with questions we couldn't begin to answer. It didn't matter what we thought we'd seen or what we believed. Something had happened out there, and whatever it wasn't meant for us to understand. As we loaded the last of the equipment into the van, I took one last look at the stone circle. For a moment, it seemed to shift again, the symbols on the ground almost glowing beneath the gray morning sky. But when I blinked, it was just a circle of stones in the middle of the salt flats, as mundane and lifeless as anything else. Yet I knew, deep down, that something had been watching us all night. We left the salt flats in silence, the weight of what had happened pressing down on us, unspoken but heavy. Sarah sat in the back, staring out the window, her expression vacant, still disconnected from reality. A few miles out, Tara suggested we go back for the gear we left behind, but no one agreed. It was as if the thought of returning, even for a moment, was too much to bear. Months later, the footage we had captured remained untouched. None of us wanted to see what might have been lurking in the shadows of those recordings. The thought of it was too unsettling. Sarah never fully recovered. She would sometimes speak of strange dreams, visions of the stones, flickering shadows, and that eerie figure watching from the horizon, though she never remembered it clearly. None of us pressed her for details. I still think about that night, especially when it rains. The way the air felt, how the shadows seemed alive, and how we never got answers. Just the lingering, terrifying possibility that we had stumbled onto something meant to stay hidden. It was a rainy evening when we arrived at the prison ruins. The rain wasn't the heavy, cleansing kind. It was more like a slow, endless drizzle that seeped into everything. Our clothes, the ground, the air. We had driven 3 hours for this, expecting little more than an adventure into West Virginia's forgotten history. The prison was abandoned, left to rot deep in the woods. Nature had started taking over, with ivy and moss crawling up its walls like slow-moving fingers. The road leading up to the prison was a mess of mud and gravel, forcing us to park the car half a mile away. We hiked the rest, our boots sinking slightly into the wet ground with every step. It didn't seem like a great idea anymore, but it was too late to turn back. No one wanted to admit they were second-guessing this trip, so we trudged on. By the time we reached the prison gates, the drizzle had soaked us through. The iron bars were rusted, some bent and twisted, as if something had tried to break free long ago. "Not exactly a 5-star destination," Mike said, shaking the rain from his jacket. We all laughed, but it felt forced, like we were trying too hard to enjoy the moment. The entrance hall was worse than we'd imagined. The ceiling had collapsed in places, and broken glass littered the floor. There was an eerie stillness inside, despite the rain tapping against the windows. We didn't talk much as we explored. Our footsteps were the only sound, and even those seemed too loud. The cell block was in the farthest part of the prison, where the air felt thicker, more stifling. I couldn't explain why, but the deeper we went, the heavier it all felt. Maybe it was the age of the place, the knowledge that men had lived and died here. Maybe it was just the rain making everything feel colder, gloomier. We found the carvings in one of the farthest cells. At first, they looked like scratches, like someone had gone mad and started gouging into the stone walls. But the closer we got, the more deliberate they seemed. Symbols, spirals, lines that connected into something we couldn't quite make sense of. "Looks like someone had a little too much time on their hands," Sarah muttered, but there was a nervous edge to her voice. Mike laughed again, but it was the same forced laugh from before. I ran my fingers over the marks, curious. They were deep, almost too deep for someone to have scratched in with just their nails or even a tool. There was a strange coldness to the stone, colder than the rest of the prison walls. We all looked at each other, silently agreeing not to talk about how odd it felt in that cell. As we turned to leave, Mike snapped a quick photo of the carvings, shaking his head like it was nothing. But none of us stayed in that cell for more than a minute longer. We didn't mention it. But the rain had started falling heavier by the time we got back to the car. The rain was relentless, drumming steadily on the roof of the car as we drove back to the small cabin we'd rented for the night. It felt like it had been raining forever, the kind of downpour that you start to tune out, but it never really stops. The drive was quiet, each of us lost in our own thoughts, the glow of the headlights bouncing off the slick, dark road ahead. "I'll tell you one thing," Mike said, finally breaking the silence. "I'm not going back to that place. Too creepy, even for me." Sarah chuckled softly, but there was no humor in it. I knew what he meant. There was something about that prison, something we couldn't quite shake off. The cabin was only about 20 minutes from the prison, tucked away in a forest that seemed even more isolated in the rain. By the time we pulled up, the light was fading, the sky turning from gray to pitch black. We hurried inside, hoping to shake off the chill from the rain-soaked hike. The fireplace in the corner looked more inviting than ever, and we quickly got a fire going. But the warmth did little to ease the strange feeling hanging over us. There was an awkward silence as we settled in, each of us trying not to acknowledge the obvious. Mike fiddled with his camera, reviewing the pictures he had taken, while Sarah absent-mindedly scrolled through her phone. The rain against the windows seemed louder in the quiet of the cabin. "I think I got a decent shot of those carvings," Mike said suddenly. leaning forward to show us the screen. The photo was clear enough, the symbols etched into the stone as bizarre and intricate as we remembered. But as I looked closer, something didn't seem right. In the corner of the shot, there was a shadow, a long, twisted shape that hadn't been there when we were standing in the cell. "Is that someone?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. We all stared at the screen, trying to make sense of it. There hadn't been anyone else in that part of the prison with us. "Maybe it's just the way the light hit the wall," Mike said, though even he didn't sound convinced. We passed the camera around, each of us taking a closer look, but the shadow was unmistakable. It was there, leaning into the frame, like something or someone was watching us. The more I looked at it, the more I realized how wrong the shape was. It wasn't a person, it was something else. "Well, that's not creepy at all," I muttered, trying to lighten the mood, but the unease was creeping in again. The rest of the evening passed quietly, but none of us could relax. The fire crackled softly, the rain continued to pour, but every once in a while, we'd hear a noise. A creak, a tap at the window, a gust of wind that sounded too much like footsteps outside. "It's just the rain," Mike said for the third time, as if trying to convince himself more than us. But we all felt it. Something was wrong. Night had fully taken over by the time we decided to turn in. The rain hadn't let up, hammering the roof in steady sheets, but inside the cabin, it was unnervingly quiet. Too quiet, really, despite the rain, the fire, and the occasional shuffle of someone trying to get comfortable. We had split up across the cabin. Mike and Sarah were in the small bedroom, and I took the couch in the living room. The firelight flickered softly against the walls, casting shadows that seemed to stretch a little too long, a little too far. Lying there, I kept thinking about the prison, those strange carvings, and the shadow in Mike's photo. My thoughts kept drifting back to that moment in the cell when I touched the carvings. Something about it still clung to me, like I'd left a piece of myself there, or worse, brought something back. I had just started to drift off when a noise cut through the steady patter of rain. At first, it was faint, just a soft, rhythmic tapping. I told myself it was just a branch brushing the side of the cabin. But then it grew louder, closer. It was a tapping, like fingernails against glass. I sat up, staring at the window across the room, half expecting to see something staring back at me. But there was nothing there, just darkness and rain streaking down the glass. My pulse quickened as I tried to listen for any other sounds. Then, without warning, Sarah screamed from the bedroom. The sound was raw, desperate, and sent me bolting from the couch before I even knew what I was doing. I nearly tripped over the coffee table as I scrambled toward the bedroom door. Mike already there, fumbling with the handle. He pushed the door open, and what I saw stopped me in my tracks. Sarah was thrashing in the bed, tangled in the sheets like she was trying to fight something off. Her hands were clutching at her arms, her face twisted in pain, but there was nothing, no one, there with her. Mike rushed to her side, grabbing her wrists, trying to calm her down. "Sarah, it's just a nightmare. Wake up," he shouted, but she wasn't listening. She kept saying the same thing, over and over. "It's clawing at me. It won't stop. It's here. It's here." Her voice was barely recognizable, full of terror. And then I saw it. Thin, red lines appearing on her arms as if something invisible was dragging its nails across her skin. I couldn't move. I just stood there, watching as those scratches deepened, more and more of them crisscrossing her skin. There was nothing touching her, no explanation for what was happening. I don't know how long I stood frozen before Mike yelled for me to grab something, anything, to help. I grabbed a blanket, threw it over her, and we tried to drag her out of the bed. Her body fought against us, still writhing as if trying to break free of some invisible grip. It took all of our strength to pull her into the living room, where the fire had started to die down, leaving the room dim and filled with long shadows. The scratches stopped, but Sarah was sobbing now, her arms red and raw. She kept whispering about something in the room, something she couldn't see but could feel. Mike and I exchanged a look, both of us thinking the same thing. We had to leave. Now. But as we hurried to gather our things, the sound came back. That tapping against the window, but louder this time, more insistent. and then the lights flickered once, twice, and went out completely, plunging the cabin into darkness. The darkness swallowed the room, leaving us standing there, paralyzed by what just happened. The rain continued to pound on the roof, but without the light, the cabin felt smaller, suffocating, like the shadows were closing in. Sarah was huddled on the couch, trembling under the blanket, still muttering about the things she felt scratching at her skin. Mike fumbled for his phone, but his hands were shaking and it slipped to the floor. The tapping at the window had stopped, replaced by an eerie stillness outside. The kind that made the hairs on the back of my neck prickle, even though I couldn't explain why. We were alone. Or at least, we wanted to believe we were. Mike's phone light flickered on, casting weak beams across the room. His face was pale, his jaw clenched. "We need to get out of here." His voice was low, barely more than a whisper, like he was afraid saying it any louder might wake something up. I couldn't agree more. We grabbed what we could, jackets, phones, keys, without saying a word. I threw the front door open, expecting to feel relief as we rushed out, but the second we stepped into the cold night air, I knew something was wrong. The rain came down in sheets, drenching us instantly, but there was no sound outside other than the downpour. No wind, no rustling trees, nothing but rain. Mike was already halfway to the car, Sarah stumbling after him. I was about to follow when I froze in place. There, just outside the cabin, barely illuminated by the weak glow from Mike's phone, was a set of footprints in the mud. They weren't ours. They were fresh, too fresh. Leading right up to the window where we had heard the tapping, the realization hit me, cold and sharp. Someone, or something, had been out there, watching us. And it wasn't just some random hiker or lost traveler. There was a purpose to it, a darkness that followed us from the prison. I didn't have time to say anything before Mike's shout tore through the night. I ran toward the car, finding him standing still, his phone light flickering out just as he pointed at something behind the cabin. There, standing at the edge of the tree line, barely visible in the pouring rain, was a figure. A tall, twisted silhouette, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. I could feel the weight of it, the connection, the thing that had been in that prison cell, the carvings, the chains. It wasn't some ghost story, wasn't some urban legend. It was real, and it was here. Right in front of us. Mike backed toward the car, his voice shaking as he shouted for us to get in, to drive, to get as far away from this place as possible. But my feet stayed rooted to the ground for just a second too long, watching as that shadowy figure seemed to shift, almost like it was getting closer without moving. The scratches on Sarah's arms flashed in my mind. The cold feeling of the carvings under my fingers, the whispers I'd heard in the prison. It was all connected, part of something bigger. Something we couldn't explain but could feel with every fiber of our being. We finally piled into the car, slamming the doors shut, the engine sputtering to life as Mike floored the gas. The tires spun in the mud before finding grip, sending us skidding onto the slick road. We didn't look back. None of us wanted to see if that figure was still standing there, or worse, if it was following us. The rain hammered on the windshield as we sped away, but no matter how far we drove, the feeling of that presence never left us. It was like we had crossed a line back in that prison, and now something had attached itself to us. Something that wasn't letting go. As we tore down the winding roads, the headlights barely cutting through the rain, I couldn't stop thinking about that inmate, the one who claimed he was possessed. Maybe he wasn't crazy. Maybe the chains weren't meant to hold him. Maybe they were meant to hold something else, something that was now free. And it was coming for us. It's been weeks since that night, but none of us have been the same. Sarah's still covered in scars, though she refuses to talk about what happened. Mike's convinced we imagined the whole thing, but I know he doesn't believe his own words. We've barely spoken about the figure we saw, the scratches, the carvings, but the memory lingers like an open wound. I keep thinking about that prison, the chains in that cell. Something was left behind there, something we shouldn't have disturbed. Sometimes late at night, I hear the same tapping on my window. It's never loud, never insistent. Just enough to remind me that whatever we let out hasn't forgotten us. I never look, I can't. We escaped that night, but a part of me knows the story isn't over. Whatever was chained to the past is still waiting. We were heading down this winding road in South Carolina. It was late afternoon, and we had decided to explore one last spot before calling it a day. Sam was in the passenger seat, eyes glued to his phone, giving me directions that seemed more like vague guesses than actual navigation. "It's supposed to be deep in the woods." "We're almost there," he muttered, sounding as unsure as I felt. The forest around us was thick, the kind of place where you could lose yourself in more ways than one. The trees formed a canopy overhead, letting in just enough light to give everything an eerie, dim glow. It was still raining lightly, that misty kind of rain that never really lets up but never fully pours. The kind that makes the roads slick and the woods feel endless. We joked around, as we usually did, about how we always ended up in the creepiest places. "This is what we get for being urban explorers, right?" I said, half laughing, trying to keep the mood light as the trees closed in around us. Sam chuckled, but it was that nervous kind of laugh. You could tell he was trying to shake off the creeping weirdness of the whole thing. When we finally reached the spot, there it was, the old abandoned church. Hidden deep in the woods, almost swallowed by the forest itself. The wooden structure was barely standing, tilted like it had been holding on for far too long. Moss covered the sides, and the roof sagged in places where the rain had taken its toll over the years. The windows, or what was left of them, were shattered and dark. Even from the car, I could see the altar at the far end of the room, lit by a dim light filtering through the overcast sky. We parked the car just a few feet from the entrance. I grabbed my flashlight, though it wasn't quite dark yet, and we stepped out into the drizzle. The air smelled damp and earthy, and our shoes squelched in the muddy ground with each step. As we got closer to the entrance, Sam stopped and pointed to something on the ground. A candle, burned almost all the way down, sitting just outside the doorway. "Weird," he said quietly. We both shrugged it off. People leave weird stuff in these kinds of places all the time. We stepped inside. The door creaked open, the sound bouncing off the walls of the empty church. The rain outside seemed louder here, even though we were inside now. It drummed steadily against the roof, dripping through the cracks where the wood had rotted away. The place was a mess. Pews scattered around, some overturned, some broken. Mold crawled up the walls, and there were more candles, scattered along the aisles and near the altar, all half-burned like they'd been used recently. It was clear that this place had seen visitors before us, but not the kind you'd want to meet. Sam walked ahead, scanning the area with his phone, taking a few pictures for the blog. I wandered towards the altar, drawn by something I'd yet couldn't quite put my finger on. Then I saw it. A pile of bones. Small, but unmistakably bones. Animal, maybe, I told myself, but it didn't look like something that had been left by scavengers. There was something too precise about the way they were arranged. Neatly, like someone had placed them there intentionally. I called Sam over, and he took one look before shaking his head. "This is messed up, man," he muttered, though he didn't seem scared. "Not yet." He was curious. We both were. It was why we did this, after all. To see the things other people were too afraid to look for. We stayed inside that church longer than we should have. The rain outside started to pick up, tapping harder against the roof, but we didn't care. Sam was off near the back, poking around in what used to be some kind of storage room. Meanwhile, I stayed near the altar, staring at those bones longer than I probably should have. There was something else that caught my eye near the bones. Melted wax, in long trails, leading to a circle of candles that had clearly been used more recently than I wanted to admit. Each one was a different size, as if they'd been added over time, maybe by different people. Some of the wicks were still black, like they'd been extinguished not too long ago. It didn't make sense that they were still here, undisturbed, especially out in the open like this. "Hey, you seeing this?" I called out to Sam. He didn't answer right away, but I heard him moving around in the back, probably caught up in whatever he'd found back there. I took a few steps back from the altar, something about the whole thing starting to feel wrong. My hand brushed against the edge of one of the pews, and I noticed it. The carvings. Deep scratches etched into the wood, forming strange symbols I didn't recognize. They weren't letters, they weren't anything I'd seen before. I ran my fingers over the carvings, feeling the grooves. Whoever did this had spent some time here. That was when Sam finally reappeared, holding up something in his hand. "Check this out," he said, his voice echoing just a little too loudly in the empty space. He was holding a small book. The cover was worn and cracked, the pages yellowed with age. It was one of those old leather-bound things, the kind that seemed too personal to be left behind. I took the book from him, flipping through the pages. Most of it was written in some kind of script I couldn't make sense of, like it had been copied from something older. Some pages were filled with sketches, crude and unsettling. Demonic faces, horns, and more of those strange symbols. What the hell were they doing here? I muttered, more to myself than to Sam. Then came the sound. A single sharp noise, like something scraping against the floor behind us. We both turned at the same time, but there was nothing there. The pews were empty. The rain outside had become a constant backdrop, almost loud enough to drown out everything else, almost. "Probably the wind," Sam said, though I could tell he didn't believe it. Neither did I. Still, we both tried to play it off, moving further into the church, like we were still in control of the situation. But the thing was, every step we took seemed to echo longer than it should have, like the church was listening, waiting for something. It didn't help that the light was fading fast. The gray clouds outside blocked out what little daylight was left, casting long shadows across the broken pews. Sam wandered back to the altar, still snapping pictures, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone, that something, somewhere in this place, was paying attention to us. Watching. The air felt different now, heavier, colder, like the rain had crept inside, even though we were still under the roof. I thought about telling Sam we should leave. I even opened my mouth to say something. But just then, another sound hit us. It wasn't a scrape this time. It was a whisper, faint, just above the sound of the rain, like it was coming from the walls themselves. We both froze in place, listening, and then it came again, this time clearer. A voice, low and soft, but unmistakable, speaking words I couldn't understand. Sam shot me a look, his casual curiosity gone, replaced with something else, something closer to fear. We turned back toward the door, moving faster now, the rain outside sounding more like a storm as it pounded against the wood. And just as we reached the entrance, something happened that made my skin crawl. The door slammed shut. The sound of that door slamming shut echoed through the church, bouncing off the decaying walls. Sam and I both stared at it, frozen for a second, not saying a word. It hadn't been windy enough to do that, and we both knew it. But standing there, we couldn't make sense of what just happened. Sam was the first to move, striding toward the door, his footsteps loud against the worn wooden floor. "Must have been a draft or something," he muttered, though there wasn't any conviction in his voice. He grabbed the handle, twisted it, pulled, and nothing. The door wouldn't budge. He pulled again, harder this time, but the door stayed firmly in place, like something on the other side was holding it shut. I moved to help him, grabbing the handle, yanking with everything I had. But it was no use. We were stuck. "You've got to be kidding me," Sam said under his breath, his voice thin. I shot him a look, the same thought running through both our heads. This wasn't a normal door, and this wasn't some freak accident. The whispers started up again, only this time they were louder, closer. It wasn't like someone speaking to us. It was more like the walls themselves had found a voice, the words wrapping around us, curling into our ears. Sam stepped back from the door, his eyes wide as he scanned the room, his confidence from earlier completely gone. "I don't like this, man," he whispered, not even trying to mask the fear anymore. I nodded, but my mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do next. We were stuck in an abandoned church, with no one around for miles, no way out, and something we couldn't see or explain was definitely with us. That's when I heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, and they were coming from behind the altar. My stomach tightened as I turned to look, but there was nothing there. Just the same dark, empty space we had walked into an hour ago. But the footsteps didn't stop. They continued, circling around the pews, getting closer, the sound of each step sinking into the floorboards with a weight that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. Sam stepped back toward me, his eyes darting around, trying to find the source of the sound. We both spun around as the footsteps seemed to move to the other side of the room. Something was pacing. Something we couldn't see. I felt an overwhelming urge to run, but we were locked in. There was nowhere to go. "Who's there?" Sam called out, his voice trembling just enough to betray his attempt at bravado. But there was no answer, just the steady, echoing steps moving closer and closer. Then, from behind the altar, a shadow seemed to stretch, like it was crawling along the floor. Something that wasn't there before, something that shouldn't be there at all. I grabbed Sam's arm, pulling him back with me as we moved further toward the middle of the room, away from the growing shadow. But it didn't stop. It kept spreading, like liquid, flowing out from the altar, covering the ground in darkness. "We need to get out of here now," I said through gritted teeth. Sam was already ahead of me, racing back to the door, yanking at the handle again, slamming his shoulder into it in a desperate attempt to get it open. But no matter what he did, it wouldn't move. And then the whispers turned into voices. Distinct, angry voices, chanting something that neither of us could understand. The words fast, chaotic, filling the space until it felt like the room was vibrating. The shadow continued to spread, stretching toward us, until it was almost touching our shoes. Just as I was about to completely lose it, Sam let out a shout, throwing himself against the door one last time. And something shifted. The door cracked open just enough to let the cold night air rush in. Without even thinking, we bolted. We didn't look back. We didn't care about what we left behind. We just ran, as fast as we could, through the rain, through the trees, until the church was nothing but a fading nightmare behind us. But even as we sprinted away, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was in that church, it wasn't finished with us yet. We didn't stop running until we reached the car. The rain was heavier now, soaking us to the bone, but that didn't matter. Sam fumbled with the keys, dropping them twice before finally getting the door unlocked. We both piled in, slamming the door shut, breathing hard, staring straight ahead at the windshield, rain splattering against the glass. Neither of us said a word for a while. The engine was running, but Sam didn't move. He just sat there, gripping the steering wheel, knuckles white. I stared out into the trees, half expecting to see that shadow creeping toward us, but the forest was just as still and dark as it had been before we entered that church. Only now, it didn't feel like we had escaped anything at all. "What the hell just happened in there?" Sam finally muttered, more to himself than to me. His voice was low, almost defeated. I didn't know how to answer. Part of me didn't want to even think about it. But the sounds, the voices, the way that shadows seemed to come alive, I couldn't just ignore it. "I don't know, man," I said quietly, leaning back against the seat, trying to process everything. But that wasn't normal. None of it was. I wiped my hands across my face, the rainwater mixing with sweat, and I felt a chill crawl through me. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what we'd seen, what we'd heard. As we sat there, I started piecing things together. The bones by the altar, the melted candles, the carvings in the wood, it all pointed to something old, something dark. People had been there before us, performing rituals, leaving behind those symbols, lighting those candles. And whoever they were, whatever they had been doing, it wasn't over. Then Sam spoke up again, his voice trembling slightly. "Do you remember the website where we found this place? The story about those disappearances?" He didn't need to finish the sentence for me to remember. It was a vague article, some amateur blog post about unexplained disappearances around this area, with rumors of a cursed church hidden in the woods. At the time, it had seemed like nothing more than a campfire story. But now it didn't feel like just a story. The rain pounded harder against the windshield, blurring the trees beyond. "They said people came here, looking for something," Sam continued, his eyes locked on the road ahead, "and they never came back." I could feel the weight of his words sinking in, the fresh wax on those candles, the bones, the shadows that moved on their own. Whatever had happened to those people, whatever force was tied to that church, it hadn't let them go. And for a terrifying moment, I realized we had almost become part of that story. Sam finally snapped out of his daze, throwing the car into reverse, backing out of that clearing faster than I thought was safe. The tires spun for a second in the mud before catching traction, and soon we were speeding down that narrow, winding road, the rain streaking across the windows. But even as we left that place behind, the voices we had heard, that chanting, it stayed with me, swirling in my mind, growing louder the more I thought about it. I didn't say anything to Sam, but deep down I had this sickening feeling that we hadn't actually escaped. Not completely. It wasn't until we were halfway back to town, when the rain started to ease, that I noticed something strange. My phone had been buzzing with notifications. I pulled it out, glancing at the screen, and there they were. Pictures. Dozens of them, from inside the church. The thing was, I hadn't taken any photos, at least not intentionally. But there they were. Pictures of the altar, the pews, even some close-ups of those symbols carved into the wood. And in the last photo, just behind the altar, there was a shadow, taller than any of the others. A figure, standing perfectly still. My heart sank, and I quickly shut off my phone, not ready to show Sam what I had just seen. I couldn't bring myself to look at it again. We didn't talk much on the drive home. The rain had finally stopped, but the silence between us hung heavy, like neither of us wanted to acknowledge what had happened, or what we had just barely escaped. A few weeks passed, and we kept our distance from each other. We didn't text, didn't meet up for more explorations. It was like both of us were pretending it hadn't happened. But the weight of it stayed with me, always lingering just beneath the surface. Every now and then, I'd catch myself thinking about that last photo. The shadowy figure standing near the altar. I hadn't shown it to Sam, and I wasn't sure if I ever would. Part of me hoped it was just a trick of the light, some illusion caused by the rain or the broken windows. But another part of me knew better. One night I saw an article pop up in my newsfeed. Another disappearance near the same woods, same church. The details were vague, just like the other stories, but the connection was unmistakable. Someone else had gone there, looking for something, and now they were gone. I stared at the screen for a long time, the memories of that night rushing back. I could still hear the whispers, still feel the weight of those unseen footsteps. And I realized, whatever cursed history that church held, it wasn't finished claiming its victims. Sam and I were just lucky enough to leave, but I wasn't sure how long that luck would last. It was supposed to be a simple road trip, the kind where you throw some bags in the back, blast the music too loud, and watch the world blur by as you head nowhere in particular. We had been driving for hours, passing through small towns with faded signs and gas stations that looked like they hadn't been updated since the 70s. The kind of places where you don't stop unless you absolutely have to. I remember glancing at the dashboard, noticing we were getting low on fuel, but the next station wasn't for miles. Still, it was the middle of the day. The weather was decent, a light drizzle tapping against the windshield, just enough to remind us we were in the Pacific Northwest. The trees started to close in as the highway narrowed, the forest thickening on either side, and the clouds above grew darker. We hadn't seen another car for a while, and that's when I saw it. A small, rusted sign on the side of the road, almost hidden behind the overgrown brush. Toll road ahead, it said, the letters barely legible, as if the sign had been there for decades without anyone bothering to replace it. Strange, I thought, who even charges tolls out here? But we didn't think much of it, just a weird old sign on an otherwise empty road. We laughed it off, figuring we'd missed some quirky Oregonian relic. But then the GPS started glitching. First, it lost signal, then it came back, recalculating over and over. My partner James tried fiddling with it, but the screen just showed a blank map, as if we had driven off the edge of the world. "You think we should turn back?" I asked, half joking. "Let's keep going. It's probably nothing," he shrugged. And so we did. As we drove deeper, the drizzle turned into heavier rain. The wipers clicked rhythmically, struggling to keep the windshield clear, and the forest around us seemed to press in closer. It was then that the first unsettling detail hit me. The road didn't feel right. We hadn't passed a single car or house for what seemed like miles, and yet the asphalt beneath us was in perfect condition, smooth and well maintained. Too perfect, considering the remoteness of this place. But there it was, stretching ahead of us into the endless rain. No signs, no exits, no reason for this road to even exist out here. "Isn't it weird?" I said, trying to shake off the creeping feeling gnawing at the back of my mind. James shrugged again, focusing on the road, but I could see the tension creeping into his jawline. We weren't lost, but it sure felt like it. And that's when I noticed something flicker in the distance ahead of us. Just for a second, through the rain, I thought I saw the faint outline of a small structure. It looked like a booth, an old toll booth. But then it was gone, swallowed up by the rain and the endless stretch of road. I opened my mouth to say something, but stopped. It couldn't have been anything, could it? The rain hadn't let up. If anything, it was falling harder now, streaking down the windows and distorting everything outside. I watched as the trees blurred into dark, shadowy shapes, all blending into the same monotonous green. The road seemed to stretch on forever, a straight line that disappeared into the horizon. No signs, no markers, just the endless ribbon of asphalt cutting through the dense forest. "We've been driving for hours," James muttered, his fingers gripping the steering wheel a little too tight. I checked my phone for the umpteenth time, but of course there was no signal. Not even a single bar. The GPS was still useless, frozen on the same blank screen. "Maybe we should turn back," I suggested again, but this time it wasn't a joke. James didn't respond right away. He just kept his eyes on the road, the rhythmic thump of the wipers the only sound breaking the silence. But then, there it was again. A flash of light up ahead. Just for a second, I sat up straighter, squinting through the rain, trying to make out what it was. "Do you see that?" I asked, pointing toward the road ahead. James glanced up, but whatever I had seen was gone now. "There was something up there," I insisted, feeling a strange knot forming in my stomach. "A booth or something. I swear it was there a minute ago." James didn't say anything, but I could tell he was getting uneasy too. The road felt wrong, like it wasn't supposed to be here, and then the car sputtered. Just once, a quick stutter like it had hiccuped. James frowned, glancing at the dashboard. The fuel gauge, which had been low but not critical, was suddenly dipping into the red. "What the hell?" he muttered, tapping the gauge as if that would fix it. The engine made another noise, a soft, grinding sound that sent a chill through the air inside the car. I looked out the window, feeling more trapped than ever. The rain pounded against the roof, relentless, and then the car sputtered again, and this time it died completely. The headlights dimmed, the engine groaned once more, and then nothing. Just the sound of the rain beating against the windshield, and the eerie stillness that followed. James tried the ignition. Nothing. He tried again and again, but the engine wouldn't turn over. We sat there in the dark, the rain falling harder now, and that's when I saw it. Out of the corner of my eye, in the distance, barely visible through the downpour, a faint light, a flickering, dim light. And next to it, the shadowy outline of what could only be described as a toll booth, an old, weathered toll booth that hadn't been there a minute ago. "Do you see that?" I whispered, barely able to get the words out. James looked up, his eyes narrowing as he stared into the rain. "I see it," he said quietly, his voice tense. There was no road leading to it, no reason for it to be there. And yet, there it stood, flickering in the rain, just waiting for us. For a moment, neither of us moved. The rain was coming down in sheets, so thick it was like looking through a waterfall. But that light, it didn't go away. It was steady, unwavering, cutting through the downpour. And behind it, the outline of that old toll booth was clearer now, like it had always been there. Just waiting for us to notice. "We should go check it out," James said, though he didn't sound convinced. I stared at him, wondering if he was serious. But what other choice did we have? The car was dead, the road stretched endlessly in both directions, and there was no one else around. Against my better judgment, I nodded. We stepped out into the rain, instantly soaked, and made our way toward the booth. With each step, the light flickered slightly, casting strange shadows on the wet road. The closer we got, the more wrong it felt. The booth was old, ancient almost. The wood was splintered and gray, and the glass in the window was fogged over, as if no one had bothered to clean it in decades. But the light inside was still glowing, dim, but enough to guide us. We approached cautiously, and I could feel something unsettling in the air, like a pressure building, but I couldn't put my finger on it. James reached out to knock on the glass, but before his hand made contact, the window slid open, revealing a man inside. If you could call him that. He was hunched over, barely visible through the flickering light, his skin pale and stretched too tight over his bones. His eyes were sunken, hollow, as if there was nothing behind them, and his mouth, when he spoke, barely moved. "Do you have the toll?" he rasped, his voice like dry leaves rustling together. I froze. James blinked, shaking his head. "We don't have any cash on us," he said, trying to sound casual, though I could hear the strain in his voice. The figure in the booth didn't move, didn't blink, just stared at us with those empty eyes. "No cash?" he asked, almost amused. His mouth twisted into something like a smile, but it was wrong. Too wide, too sharp. "Then you'll have to pay another way," he continued, his voice growing colder, deeper. James took a step back, his hand brushing against mine, and I could feel the tension between us rising. "What do you mean?" I asked, the words barely audible. The tollkeeper leaned forward, his bony fingers tapping the edge of the booth. "Something of value, a piece of yourself. Time, perhaps. Or something more precious," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. My mind raced, trying to make sense of his words, but nothing about this made any sense. The air felt heavier, the rain pounding harder around us, and all I could focus on was the way his eyes never left ours, like he was waiting. Waiting for us to offer something we didn't understand. James tried to speak, but no words came out. The tollkeeper's hand moved, slowly, deliberately, sliding across the counter of the booth as if reaching for us. His nails were long, cracked, and filthy. I wanted to turn and run, but my feet wouldn't move. "We don't have anything," I finally managed, my voice trembling. The tollkeeper grinned wider, a grin that stretched too far across his face, revealing teeth that were unnaturally sharp. "Oh, you do," he said softly, his voice dripping with something I couldn't quite place. "And you will pay, one way or another." At that moment, the light in the booth flickered violently, plunging us into near darkness for a split second. When it came back, the tollkeeper was standing outside the booth, inches from us. We hadn't seen him move. I felt a cold grip tighten around my chest, though I couldn't understand why. "We need to go," James whispered, his voice barely a breath. I nodded, but my legs felt heavy, rooted to the spot. The tollkeeper's eyes gleamed, and his voice dropped to a near growl. "The road only goes one way now," he said. "There's no turning back." James grabbed my arm, and that broke the spell. We backed away from the booth, our shoes splashing in the puddles gathering on the cracked asphalt. The tollkeeper didn't move. He just stood there, his twisted grin still stretching across his pale face, watching us. I could feel the weight of his stare pressing against my back as we retreated. I wanted to run, but every step felt slower, like the air itself was thickening around us. "We need to get back to the car," James muttered, pulling me along, though his eyes kept flicking back toward the booth. But the car, it was useless. The engine was dead. I glanced at the tollkeeper, who was still standing there, silent, motionless, just waiting. It was then that the full weight of the situation hit me. This wasn't just some creepy toll booth in the middle of nowhere. There was something more, something ancient about it. The road we had taken, the empty stretch that seemed to appear out of nowhere. It wasn't on any map for a reason. I remembered the stories, urban legends, whispered rumors about places like this. Roads where people disappeared without a trace, where no one ever found out what happened to them. My mind raced back to the sign we had seen earlier, the one warning about the toll. Only, it wasn't really about a toll, was it? It was a warning to stay away. This road wasn't supposed to be here. It was a trap, a place where people like us wandered in and never came back. I looked over at James, but before I could say anything, the rain began to fall harder, turning into a near torrent. And then I heard it. A whisper so faint I almost thought it was the wind, but it wasn't. It was coming from the tollkeeper. He was speaking not to us, but to something else, something unseen. Something that I could feel lurking just beyond the veil of rain and darkness. James and I exchanged a look. We needed to go. Now. The tollkeeper's voice grew louder, the words twisting into something incomprehensible, something older than the language we knew. I didn't understand the words, but I understood their meaning. We had to give him something, or we wouldn't leave. Just give him something, I muttered under my breath, though I had no idea what. Something personal, James replied, his voice barely audible over the pounding rain. I thought of the stories, of how some people paid tolls with more than just money. Time, memories, a piece of themselves. James reached into his pocket, pulling out his old watch, the one his grandfather had given him years ago. It wasn't much, but it was something of value, something that mattered. He hesitated for a moment, then held it out toward the tollkeeper. The tollkeeper's eyes gleamed as he took the watch, his long, gnarled fingers closing around it. For a moment, everything was still. The rain seemed to stop, the air hung heavy, and we just stood there waiting. And then, without a word, the tollkeeper stepped back into the booth. The light inside flickered once, twice, and then went out completely. The booth disappeared into the darkness, as if it had never been there. James and I didn't move. We stood there in the rain, soaked to the bone, staring at the empty spot where the toll booth had stood just moments before. But there was nothing left. No booth, no light, no sign of the tollkeeper. Only the road stretching endlessly in front of us. And behind us, where the car had been parked, I could see the faint outline of headlights. The car was working again. Without saying a word, we turned and walked back toward it, our footsteps splashing in the puddles that had gathered on the road. But something felt wrong. The car, it wasn't where we had left it. It was farther down the road, much farther, as if we had walked miles without realizing it. James and I exchanged a glance, but neither of us said anything. We didn't need to. We both knew something had changed. Something we couldn't explain. We got into the car, the engine roaring to life without any trouble, and we drove. Neither of us looked back. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't left that place behind. Not completely. We drove in silence, the rain still falling in steady sheets, but it didn't feel like the same rain. Everything looked the same, yet different. The road stretched endlessly ahead, no signs, no landmarks, just the same dark forest on either side. It felt like we had escaped, but part of me wasn't sure if we really had. James kept glancing at the rearview mirror, as if expecting to see something following us, but the road behind us was empty. When we finally made it back to civilization, the town felt strangely foreign, like we had been gone longer than we realized. We never spoke about the toll booth after that. We just told ourselves it was some strange dream. But every now and then, I catch James staring at his wrist, where his watch used to be. And sometimes, when it's quiet and the rain starts to fall, I swear I can still hear that whisper. The tollkeeper's voice, waiting for us to return.